Alright guys, VLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we are finally getting around to this massive ranking that I talked about doing last year, which I also thought would be fit to do around the 4-year anniversary of the channel. And here I will be ranking every player that has ever played Big Brother Canada. So again, this is a ranking on a scale that I have not done before. The biggest ranking I've done before this was 91 players. This list includes 148. And while I definitely do have larger rankings planned at some point down the road, I did feel like this list was still fitting to qualify for my big anniversary ranking of the year. And again, we just got through BB Can 10 last year. So again, 10 seasons of the show. It feels like a good spot to stop down and rank every player here. Now, this will be a ranking on how I feel about them in the grand scheme of Big Brother, not just on their one individual season, though obviously how they played on their one season will greatly factor into this list. But also my thoughts on these players' potentials and how they would do on multiple appearances will also play a factor as well. I will also state that this list will only include the players that actually got to play in BB Can. So we have players like Nate and Scott from BB Can 2, Jason Veronica from BB Can 4, Mikey and Kirsten from BB Can 6, and Holly from BB Can 7. All these players who were potential housemates but did not end up making the cut, they will not be on this list, as again, what game is there to assess from them? But again, every other player will be on this list. Also, in the weird case of the Pax Bros, I will be including them as separate players on this list, as I do think there is a pretty big distinction between the two. But with that, let's get into the ranking. Again, we got 148 players to rank. Let's start off at the bottom. At 148, we do have the person who I guess I'm declaring as the worst BB Can player of all time. And here, we don't have a first boot as I typically would. We have a second boot. I do have Mackie from BB Can 7. And this all stems from me looking back at my criteria for my worst players of all time for Big Brother US, where I did talk about there that I do feel like the worst players are the players that play actively bad, the ones that make the most unforced errors. And with BB Can also being a show that doesn't really dedicate much time to its first boots, where we don't get to see them on the feeds and they only get one episode, I feel like it was tough to attribute that to a lot of the first boots. Well, for me, Mackie is the epitome of that for BB Can, a player that was safe for a lot of the week, but then causes his own downfall by the end of it. It should have been a very straightforward vote, but through his extremely honest nature of telling Dane and Anthony that he's going to put him on the block if he wins HOH, that causes them to flip the vote against him. Now, the one major pro for him is the fact that he did have half the house voting with him. It did end up being a tie. However, I feel like if he were to come back and play the game again, I think his overall game philosophy would stay the same, and I do feel like he would just play actively bad again and still be too honest and blow up his own game. So for that, he's here at number 148. At 147, another actively bad player in my eyes. From BB Can 1, we have Danielle. And again, another second boot here. Danielle for me is a person that knew she wasn't in Jillian's good graces, yet despite that decides to volunteer for the block that week. And while she wasn't the initial target for Jillian, the vote does eventually flip back on her. And again, that just felt like a largely unforced error for her to straight up volunteer for the block there. Now, the reason she's above Mackie for me, though, is that, again, I feel like Mackie's errors were a lot more unforced, where Danielle might have even gone on the block even if she didn't volunteer in that position. And really, either way, wasn't really set up for that good of a run after the fact anyway, while Mackie was and actively sabotaged that. So I feel like that's enough to put her slightly above Mackie at 147. At 146, we're finally getting to some first boots all in a row here. And we have a player that I thought would be the worst coming out of the last season. And from BB Can 10, we do have Melina, the first boot of the season, who just seemed like a person that isolated herself from the beginning, didn't really seem to have many connections, seemed like a consensus boot. Supposedly, even though Jess was propped up as the target, there were still talks about Melina going home despite that. And really, Melina is the type of person that I don't know if she can do well in any season, given the fact that she just doesn't seem to care enough to play the game. And really, again, the reason why she's not at the very bottom is because I feel like we have less to work with her. We've seen more of the mistakes that Mackie and Danielle made, while we didn't see as much with Melina. So because of that, for that, Melina's slightly above them at 146. At 145, another first boot, here we do have Risha from BB Can 3, another player Don't know if there's any season that she could do well. Came off as intimidating, came off as an easy first boot, didn't really have much potential in the game. I mean, yes, she did get voted out technically by Canada, though she was going to be voted out before that twist came up anyway. And outside the potential of her potentially winning comps, I just really do not see her doing that well in any season of Big Brother. She's here at 145. At 144, probably the first boot that I think made the most active mistakes. And here from BB Can 7, we have Laura. Now, again, like for me, the tough thing about putting her at the very bottom is the fact that, again, we just saw so little of her. I did very much debate putting her at the bottom, as again, I do feel like she's the first boot that made the most blatant mistakes, coming off as a very aggressive personality while she was there, but I just do not feel like there's as much of a resume as, again, the bottom two people on the list. And in conjunction with the rest of the first boots, I do feel like at least there's some potential for Laura if she were to play again, at least over the likes of Risha and Melina, where I feel like they're obvious first boots. So for me, again, she's above them. 144. 143, very similar first boot. And from BB Can 1, the first boot ever, we have Kat. And Kat, again, I think is a person that didn't really do that much wrong. I mean, yes, she did come off a bit aggressively when talking to Suzette, seemed to be a really big gamer, but at the same time, she was trying to work with Suzette. It's not even like she was like targeting Suzette and made her know that. It's like, technically, Suzette should have looked at this as a good opportunity to work with Kat, but instead she decides to target her instead. But I do think the fact that people can perceive her as someone that is playing too hard, too fast, is definitely a negative attribute there. That's why I have her this low on the list still at 143. At 142, we probably have a person that I remember back at the time that the season aired, I was thinking that this would be an all-time worst player. However, I think over time, it's like, I guess they didn't do that much bad, and that is a Nick from BB Can 2. And a Nick is simply just there. I mean, she doesn't really do much wrong. She just seems like an easy consensus first boot off the bat on that season. However, unlike the likes of Risha and Melina, I feel like there might be some potential for a Nick to make it further in the game. Again, I feel like Melina comes off very standoffish. Risha comes off very intimidating. I feel like a Nick is none of those things. I think she's a very lively, bubbly person, and while that's probably what makes her such an easy first boot, it is also a position where I think they have more potential on any given season. So because of that, they're here at 142. At 141, we have a first boot that another one I thought would probably be at the very bottom of the list. I do think there's one extraordinary circumstance that puts him higher, and that is Nico from BB Can 8. Now, I will also say BB Can 8 is a season that is very difficult to rank on this list due to the fact that obviously the season did not finish. However, I'll obviously be assessing them based on how they played up to that point. And for me, Nico is a player that all we saw of him were pretty bad things. It seemed like he came off as a bit of a threat. People didn't bond with him, and he just seemed like an easy first boot to the point where he recognized that and decided to quit. Now, I will say for me, the thing that puts Nico above the other first boots that we've talked about is the concept of him pretty much instantly being told that Canada doesn't like him. And I think mixing that in with the fact that he was going to be a first boot, I actually fully understand why he quits the game here. Like, I do think being told that Canada doesn't like you from the very beginning is obviously something that's going to lower your morale in the game. And I think through that also affected how he was interacting with the other players. And again, like for me, it's like I do kind of have some sympathy with that aspect of all this, to where I decided to put him above a lot of these other first boots, even though realistically, again, he did end up playing a pretty underwhelming game there. Now for 140, and we're moving on to finally someone that isn't a first or second boot. However, this person also just sucks. And from BB Can 8 also, we do have Carol. And the one redeeming quality about Carol is the fact that she was in the initial majority alliance. The problem is that she gets kicked out of that alliance and eventually wants to quit. And really, she was holding up this season to where, despite all the negativity surrounding BB Can 8, it did feel like it was starting to get good in its final week until Carol decided to quit, and that sucked all the momentum out again. And really, just again, Carol just sucks. I have no faith in her overall potential in the game. While it did seem positive across the first couple weeks, when she wants to quit, it's like, don't have confidence that she wouldn't want to quit on any other season. She's here at 140. At 139, another first boot, but another one that I feel like did some of the least wrong, and that is Rosina from BB Can 6. Another player that just seemed like an easy first boot right off the bat. However, I think a difference between this and the other first boots we talked about is, one, she had people that wanted to save her. Again, we do see Andrew going well out of his way to the point where he puts a target on his own back in order to try to save her. But also, it seemed like people genuinely liked her. Like, people looked at her as a mother figure in the house, and the only reason she seems to go home is because, again, it just felt like the easy vote. So again, I don't feel like Rosina did much wrong, so she's here at 139. At 138, a player that realistically I think is probably worse than Rosina, it's just that they made it slightly further, and that is Christine from BB Can 4, who I will say, I barely remember this person coming into the list, but Christine is a person that at least won a veto. That's something. But even despite that, it's still a person that no one really wanted to work with. Christine didn't have any solid relationships or alliances in the house, and when she was on the block and went home, she was up against Cassandra and largely goes home in a vote that's mostly based around Cassandra, on people either wanting to work with Cassandra or not wanting to work with Cassandra. And Christine really just ends up being an outlier there, which is really just how I feel about her as a whole. Again, like, I don't feel like she had much potential in the game. She seemed to be pretty bad socially, to where she just seemed to annoy certain people, and also didn't really even end up being looked at as a true player in the house, where it felt like people were moving around her. And because of that, for me, she's here at 138. At 137, we have a player that I've talked about numerous times about not liking this person as a player of BB Can, at least. And here we do have Suzette from BB Can 1. And I will say again, like, I really did not like Suzette. When the season aired, I felt like she was an extremely emotional player, one that would just get upset anytime anyone tried to make a move against her, one that made a target of herself by putting up Emmett and Tom right away, and then followed that up by getting upset that Tom would come after her, only to then get saved by Canada, and then immediately after Tom's boot ends up being consensus boot the following week, in a position where the entire house agreed that they didn't want her on the jury. So again, like, I do not think Suzette played a good game at all. I think if we're looking outside of BB Can, I mean, there are reasons to think that Suzette might not be the worst player in the world, considering she has won a season of Sequester. She has demonstrated game ability outside of BB Can, but again, within the course of BB Can, I can't put her much higher here than number 137. At 136, moving on to a player I already mentioned on this list, and here we do have Andrew from BB Can 6, and Andrew's a player that I do think put a massive target on his back. I mean, while he was designated as the person to separate the groups on day one, I do feel like that's a position that should give you a lot of power. However, instead he becomes a social outcast from it. He again goes out of his way to save Rosina in a position where he just puts a further target on his back and ends up being taken out by his own closest ally due to the fact that it was such a consensus concept that Andrew is going to be the boot. All these aspects of his game are really, really bad, and I do have to leave him here as 136. At 135, I'm moving on to a player I can't believe is actually this high, considering I think this person's just looked at as a joke whenever you mention him, just due to the fact that he's just so obviously a bad player. But again, I actually have him not at the very bottom, and here we do have Poppin' Paul Jackson from BB Can 2. And again, Paul played terribly, obviously, very much like Suzette, has power very early on, decides to target the alpha guy and fails to get him out. However, I think unlike Suzette, does end up getting supporters by the time he leaves. And we do see by the following week, he does have a good relationship with Adele and Kyle comes off as a bigger threat there, where Kyle's taken out instead of Paul. And the following week after that, while Paul is used as a pawn, he does have most of the women there working alongside him. And to be fair, it's still him initially targeting Andrew that causes him to go home, as it is the constant campaigning of Andrew and Kenny that causes the votes to stay on him. I mean, he still had people that did want him to stay. So again, he's still a bad player, but I do feel like those are minor positives to leave him here at number 135. At 134, a player with a pretty similar trajectory, though I feel like did less wrong at the very beginning, and that person is Stephanie from BB Can 10. Now, Stephanie is obviously the recipient of the big blind side during the Kyle Moore HOH week, but truth be told, before that, she was still playing pretty poorly, where coming into the second week, she was already a target for the likes of Marty. However, largely gets saved in week 2 due to the fact that she ends up being at the end of the HOH comp with Marty, to where Marty decides to not target her there, though she was his initial target. But again, she's put up the following week by one of her closer allies, one of the only allies she has in the game at that point, considering most of the house doesn't really want to work with her by that point. Have that ally put her up, thinking of her as the most expendable piece on the board, instead of the asset that she would have been for Kyle's game. I do think that's pretty bad. However, her eventual boot, I do think, is less her actual fault, where against another one of these situations where it's more of an anti the HOH sort of move. Though, to be fair, it's also pro Josh as well, through the relationships that he was able to build. And even the people that voted for her to stay, and Gino and JC, didn't really even want her to stay. They just thought she was going to stay. And JC, her closest ally, was even willing to let go of her. So again, that's all pretty bad, but has minor pros across her game. So she's here at number 134. At 133, we're moving back to BB Can 8 with some players I don't know what to do with. At 133, we do have Angie. And Angie was there. She really didn't do much. I mean, considering the fact that we never saw the outcome of her game, I just feel like this is such a tough person to assess. So again, I'm landing her here at 133. At 132, we're kind of moving on to more actively bad players. At 132, we do have Minli from BB Can 8. And Minli, for me, again, is a really mediocre player, a player that comes off as really aggressive and assertive, and through that, further puts a target on her back. Throughout her entire run, she was looked at as a potential target, and she was going to go home week 3 if it had not been for the ejections of Jamar and Kyle. And then she was again the target in week 4 if it was not for Carol wanting to quit. And really, even if the season had continued, I would have expected her to be a boot within the next few weeks. So again, don't look at her too highly. She's here at number 132. And number 131, a player that I really look at as a minor step above Minli, and that is Veronica from BB Can 6. And Veronica, I think, has a couple minor positives in comparison. I think at the end of the day, they are pretty similar players. I think they are very aggressive personalities, players that play pretty hard. However, I do think Veronica is a person that had more allies. She had the likes of a Will and a Hamza and a Marin on her side. I think she also comes up to the disadvantage of coming in late, and through that was obviously harmed by that stigma. But again, by the time she goes home, ends up being an easy consensus target, ends up being a player that just played too hard. But in comparison to Min Lee, I feel like she was just slightly above her, so she's here at number 131. At number 130, we're moving on to a player that shouldn't be that bad, but I think when you remember how her game played out, it's definitely worse than what it seems on paper. And at number 130, we have Austin from BB Can 9. And again, Austin is like kind of in the archetype of these style players that typically do well and typically go far. But despite that, she didn't. She was looked at as a target from very early on. She was left outside of the initial power structure. And during her HOH, she could have greatly used that power to benefit her position, but she really just doesn't. And then proceeds to be taken out by one of her closest allies during the secret HOH week, which makes it even more questionable about why Victoria took her out in that point. And really, I think a lot of her game comes down to how passive she was in the game, where she spent so much time with the likes of Brayden that she really just did not spend that much time socializing with people outside that. And because of her passive play and how much of a target she put on herself, I have her at 130. At 129, another pretty bad player in a similar archetype from an earlier season. Here we have Kiki from BB Can 7. And Kiki's another one. Put a target on her back. Did not bond with a lot of the house. I will say the one slight positive is the fact that she did have good relationships with the likes of Damien, Esty, and Dane, though to be fair, Austin did have relationships with Kyle, Rowe, and Brayden. Kiki also gets completely outplayed by the Pretty Boys, where she largely gets taken out here as one of the most expendable pieces on Dane's board, and also sever her relationships with some of the other figures. So really for me, again, like the difference between Kiki and Austin is very minimal. I will say I think Austin had more opportunities that she squandered than Kiki, who again, Array had the Pretty Boys having complete control in the game, where she really didn't have many options. But again, still a mediocre player here at number 129. Now number 128, we're moving back to BB Can 8, and here we do have Vanessa. And Vanessa is a tough player to assess because again, there are major positives to her game. She was lumped into the initial majority alliance, was a solidly positioned player within that majority alliance. However, she's such an actively bad player that she continuously did things to sabotage her own game, to where despite her having a final 2 of Kyle and Kyle being fully loyal to her, she would constantly trash Kyle and put a further target on his back. She also, for some reason, had a vendetta against Brooke, to where despite her being in a solid alliance with Brooke, she would continuously throw her under the bus as well. And really, by the end of the season, she was starting to get caught and started to get lumped into the likes of Chris, to where I would not be surprised if she would have been a boot in the next following weeks. But again, we didn't get to see that. But again, I feel like a lot of that would be due to her own terrible gameplay. So because that for me, she's here at 128. At 127, we have, I believe, what ends up being the worst player to make the jury phase of the game. And here from BB Can 6, we have Ryan. And Ryan ends up being another one of these figures that, despite being an early HOH, he really squanders all the opportunities that he had with that. He decides to go and appease the house by getting rid of Andrew, his closest ally, in order to gain social capital, but really ends up gaining nothing and ends up still being on the bottom of the house really up until his eventual boot. where he is used as a pawn numerous times. And even outside of that, like barely survives a vote against Marin. He ends up having poor relationships with the likes of Kayla and Allie. He does build good relationships with the likes of Johnny and Paris, but a lot of those felt like more pandering for jury votes than anything. And really, he gets taken out at a spot where like he had no reason to be taken out. The fact that Johnny is able to run circles around him in his eventual boot week is really insane, considering, again, there was no reason to vote out Ryan in that position over Johnny, who ended up being one of the biggest threats on the board. So again, like, I just think Ryan played a pretty terrible game. He's here at number 127. At 126, another post-jury boot. Here we do have Jackie from BB Can 5. And I will say, I've always liked Jackie. I felt like Jackie's a player that if she was in a house, that would give her a bit more leeway. I feel like she could be a decent player. I mean, she seems to be a player that plays pretty dynamically. I mean, she's continuously put on the bottom, builds relationships with people only for them to turn their backs on her, but is able to continuously flip her allegiances. And I feel like that is a skill that is kind of impressive under the scope of Big Brother. However, at the same time, the fact that so many people turn her back on her over and over and over again is pretty bad there. And is another one that in the week that she eventually goes home, again, she's on the block against Ika, and they vote out Jackie instead of Ika. Or even in that position, Kevin, who is completely by himself by that point, outside of a sliver of a relationship with Jackie, is still willing to let her go over Ika, who is one of the bigger threats to him on the board. Again, I think that's really ridiculous, and because that, for me, Jackie's here at 126. At 125, another post-jury boots. Again, kind of a trend here. Here we do have Raul from BB Can 4. And for me, Raul, the only thing keeping him this high is the fact that he had good relationships with Jared and Kelsey, and initially came off as the lesser threat of those players. However, outside that, Raul is a really bad player, one that was really clueless in the game, had no clue what he was doing, and at the point where he finally has to make decisions with his HOH week, he ends up taking out one of the people that he's closest to in Mitch, and further makes himself a bigger target through doing so. And then in the following week, he ends up throwing the veto and helps out Jared in winning the veto, which leads to him being put on the block and taken out over Kelsey. Raul was mostly just a mindless player in the game, one that was blindly loyal to Kelsey and Jared, and made a whole bunch of suboptimal moves in order to maintain his relationships with them. So because of that, for me, Raul's pretty bad here at number 125. Now, at number 124, we have a player that, if this person did not return, I think there would be a debate for this being the worst BB Can player of all time. But considering this is a two-time player, at number 124, I do have Cindy from BB Can 3 and 5. And I've always thought that Cindy was a really terrible player. I mean, her first time around, she's a target right off the bat, has to win veto week 1, goes home week 2, re-enters the game in a position where she has so much information that she could utilize to benefit her game, and instead takes out one of the people that is the most willing to work with her in Jordan, only to be sacrificed again the following week as the one that takes the brunt of the blame for that move. Really, really bad game in BB Can 3, and in BB Can 5 makes another really asinine decision in taking out Netta, where in doing so, she again makes herself one of the biggest targets for the following round and takes out one of her own alliance members. The one thing keeping her this high is the fact that she actually played the first half of BB Can 5 pretty well. She's actually in the middle of the house for a lot of it, never really a target, so at least that was decent, but again, considering everything else that's really, really bad, she's still here at 124. Now 123, moving on to two players in a row from BB Can 1, and here we're starting it off with Liza. And Liza's a player I did debate putting higher, mainly because I do feel like Liza could potentially do better on a return. However, I do think through seeing how she's played games like Sequester and how she's received by the BB Can alumni community after the fact, I do feel like more than likely she'll just be as messy on the return. And her first time around, again, like, she had good strategic ideas. I mean, she did want to target Emmett for a lot of the game. She did try to save Neil and try to convince Tom of what was in his best interest, but the fact that she fails in all these things is definitely an indictment there, and the fact that she becomes a social pariah, where she was just such an easy consensus target for week 4, only gets to stay because Tom becomes a bigger target and then proceeds to be taken out in the double eviction. Again, like, it's pretty bad, largely due to her own actions, because that she's here at number 123. At 122, a person we just talked about. We have Tom from BB Can 1, and the only reason Tom is above Liza for me is the fact that, again, he at least had allies earlier on in the game. Now those allies drop him in week 4, which is really bad, and a lot of that coming from his HOH-itis during week 3. Though again, I mean, like, at the end of the day, it's like he is a solid comp competitor. While his HOH reign ends up being a bit of a disaster, it's also perpetuated by a twist where Suzette gets saved by Canada. And if that had not been the case, he would not have gotten rid of Anil, and keeping Anil there would have been beneficial to his game. Now, again, he still ends up making the wrong decision there. But considering the short amount of time he had to make the decision, I feel like it kind of makes sense why he does so. But again, is one that really mismanages threat level, so he's here at number 122. Now number 121, we're moving on back to a more recent season of the show. From BB Can 10, we do have Jay. And Jay's a player that I always felt like they had a lot of potential. Their nominations seem to be one already a bit wonky, where Steph was Marty's initial target, but Marty presumed to have a deal with her at the end of the HOH comp, so where he wasn't willing to put her up. But also beyond that, Jay still had people that wanted them to stay and had people that were talking about using the veto on them. And while he was pretty much drawing dead by the end of the week, I do feel like Jay has a level of potential there and kind of gets unlucky at their initial nomination. So I'm putting them here at number 121. At 120, a very similar early boot, but this one from BB Can 9, and here we do have Josh. Again, second boot of the season, another person that didn't really click with the entire house, and realistically, Jay had more allies in the game. However, I will say for Josh, I did very much respect how hard he tried. I do feel like Josh is a player that, again, should have been the first boot. He was the initial target of that first week, but was able to get the target onto Julie instead, but following that, again, still proceeds to be on the outs and gets taken out by Austin in a position where it's not in her best interest to get rid of Josh. But again, considering Josh's successful campaign in week 1 and the fact that he, again, continues to try in week 2, for me, it's good enough to land him here at 120. Now, number 119, still BB Can 9, the boot before him, we do have Julie. And again, Julie's another one of these first boots that I don't think did that much wrong. It just felt like Julie came off as a bit more of a threat than Josh. And beyond that, it's like we do see Julie build some relationships. She had a relationship with Austin and Brayden. She had a relationship with Victoria. It's like she wasn't like completely dead in the water. And while you could argue that, like, yeah, she didn't do that much to save herself, I do still feel like for her first boot, she didn't do that much wrong outside of just not connecting as much with the rest of the house and also coming off as a bigger threat. And because of that, for me, she's here at number 119. Now, number 118, we're moving on to a similar style of player. And here we do have Kaylin from BB Can 7. And Kaylin's a player that I think had some potential. I mean, she, right off the bat, builds a really strong relationship with Dane, to where it did seem like Dane was willing to fight to keep her. She also seemed to have a decent strategic mind, and where she had a somewhat accurate read of the house, though also it feels like she becomes a target because of that. And even beyond that, I mean, she technically was on the outs during the first couple weeks. Though technically beyond that, it's like, again, she's on the outs pretty much from the beginning. She tries to save Mackie and ends up failing at that. Really, I mean, there's not too much to credit for Kaylin here. However, I do feel like their potential is there if she was given a cast that was more suited towards her. And because of that, for me, I have her at 118. At 117, another BB Can 7 player. Here we do have Eddie. And Eddie's another one. I think there is a lot of potential with Eddie. I mean, Eddie was a big fan of the show. It seemed like he knew what he was doing. I just feel like he just did not gel in with this cast, where right off the bat, he's an outcast in the game, and despite that, he still survives for decent ways. However, at the end of the day, it's again like he really had no true connections in the game and no real potential for a deep run. Or by the time of his boot, it just felt like he was a pretty easy target. Now, I will say I do think he gets unlucky with the veto, where it did seem like Kiki was the initial target there. But I always feel like Eddie was just such an easy backup target in most scenarios, to where I just feel like he was looked at as pretty expendable. Because that, for me, he's here at 117. Now, number 116, moving on to one of the last first boots left on the board. Here we do have Paige from BB Can 4. And Paige is another player that, again, like, I don't feel like she did that much wrong. I mean, she was used as a pawn. However, ends up being in this scenario where, again, the pawn goes home, where BB Can 4's early game is a very interesting one, where we obviously had the mighty middle who flipped back and forth between alliances, one to weaken each side and keep the bigger targets in the game. And Paige just ends up being an easy person to perpetuate the idea, where when on the block against Kelsey was the leader of one of the sides, while Paige was, again, a person that was looked at as a potential pawn moving forward. So again, taking Paige out allowed the mighty middle to stay in the middle. And while I do think obviously you have to knock Paige for her passive gameplay across the week, I do think as a whole, I do think she gets unlucky. And that being the dynamics of this season, to where I think in most situations she wouldn't be the first boot here. So again, I don't think Paige does that much wrong, and because that she's here at 116. Now we're 115, the following boot from BB Can 4, we do have Sherry. And I remember Sherry being looked at as a big front runner early on, and it did seem like she had all the skills to be a good player. However, I mean, again, she was left on the outs of that first vote, became an easy target alongside Levita, with them being looked at as a duo, and then Levita was looked at as a bigger threat, so they took out Sherry to again continue this war between the two sides. Again, I feel like there's a lot of similarities between Sherry and Paige here, but still ends up playing a game that is largely ineffective, and because of that, she's here at 115. Now number 114, a similarly positioned player, but one that made it a bit further, and obviously on a different season. And from BB Can 5, we do have Emily. And Emily's another player that was initially on the outs, but does end up getting put into a Assault Alliance. Mind you, that alliance was kind of a fake alliance where her and Dylan were added on to alliance with the Bruno and Kevin and Nettas of the world. Though again, they were always looked at as expendable, but still were able to be in the majority while the likes of Cassandra and Gary were going home. Though at the same time, again, were used as kind of shields for them if the other side were to win power. And we do see that happen where when William wins HOH, he does go after Dylan and Emily. And Emily ends up going home here again to keep Dylan in the game, as Dylan is a bigger shield for most of the people there. So again, it is a bit of weird circumstances there. Again, for me, I do think her game is pretty similar to Sherry's, just that she makes it a few rounds longer because that she's here at number 114. Now, number 113, we have the latest boot on the board so far, but one that I just feel like is really terrible. And from BB Can 7, we do have Kira. And Kira is a player that I just always thought was really terrible. And obviously they were kept around the longest out of the non-pretty boys, largely because they were such a non-threat. They really brought nothing to the table strategically, was easily moldable to where the likes of Anthony and Adam were pretty much able to tell them whatever they wanted them to do. Also, Kira is not respected by the other players, to where there's not a single scenario where Kira wins a jury vote. Kira is also really aloof in the game, to where they were initial social outcasts, and even beyond that, really just rub people the wrong way. I mean, there's really nothing positive to say about Kira here. To where, again, despite them making it very far in the game, had no win equity, and was largely brought there just due to how non of a threat that they were. So because of that, for me, they're here at number 113. Now, number 112. Moving on to a player that was probably on a similar trajectory to Kira, but did not make it as far into the game, though at the same time probably has minor positive points over Kira. And at number 112, we have Jess from BB Can 10. And Jess is a player that I do think, like Kira, was a social outcast from very early on and was able to recover from that. However, I feel like Jess's recovery was a lot more in their hands than it was with Kira, where again, Kira just seemed to luck their way into it. I feel like Jess is a person that did do decent work in building relationships with the likes of a Kevin and a Kyle and a Marty, and like these people that did end up having some power moving forward. So I feel like that's something to definitely credit for Jess. Now, I do feel like Jess had a terrible HOH week where they're really just making moves for everyone else and puts themselves in a position where they're getting the brunt of the blame for those moves. And again, I do feel like that's poor gameplay there, and we eventually see it lead up to their eventual boot. But at the same time, they came very close to staying. They were literally one ball away from winning the competition to get safety there, and even beyond that, came very close to staying against Gino, to where had they been given more time to solidify the plan, Jess probably ends up staying there. So again, I feel like there's these pros here that definitely leave them above Kira, despite the fact that they were taken out of the game a lot earlier. So because that, they're here at 112. Now number 111, moving on to a string of relatively early boots that all came off as too threatening, but at least have some allies along the way to not put them at the very bottom of the list. And at number 111, we're starting it off with Kyle Shore from BB Can 2. Now, Kyle is probably the lesser of these people in the fact that he didn't have as many allies. He only had Adele and Paul. However, I feel like for me, the reason why he's still in this grouping is because I don't know what else Kyle could do. I mean, I think Kyle was just looked at right off the bat as a massive physical threat, and through that just became a very easy target there. Like, while obviously, yes, you do have the fault for not getting within the majority alliance, I do think the fact that he becomes the target in week 2 was just something that I don't think he could have stopped. I do feel like no matter what, he he would have been the target there just due to his initial failing to get within the majority alliance. So because of his lack of fault there, I do feel like I have to have him here at 111. At 110, moving on to the number 1 first boot on the board. And here we do have Mark from BB Can 5. Again, Mark is a player that came very close to staying, despite him being the initial target. Now, I do think Mark was unlucky in the fact that Karen was the first HOH. Karen, a person who does not play the way most people play, and through that was not afraid to put up these 2 big guys right at the beginning, and through that, I think Mark was just instantly put in a bad position there. Mind you, I will say that also Mark supposedly did talk about Karen being an easy first boot, to where that was also a factor in him being on the block to begin with, but beyond that, I mean, the target keeps on flipping back and forth between him and Dimitri, but at the end of the day, he does come very close to staying. I mean, in the very last-ditch effort, the votes almost do go his way, and the vote ends up being such a jumbled mess to where, like, no one really knew exactly where the votes were going, and a lot of that is because of how much chaos Mark is able to bring at the very last second, which almost gets him to stay there. So again, like, I feel like Mark came the closest to staying out of any of the first boots, so because that, he ends up being relatively high here for his placement at 110. Now, at 109, we have the prototypical person in this batch of players that I was talking about, a person who had a decent amount of allies, but was taken out as the biggest threat of that group. And at number 109, we have Michael from BB Can 8. And Michael is the only official boot of BB Can 8. Again, he's one of these that, again, was the leader of his alliance, was looked at as a threat, was taken out because of that. His group still stuck by him to the end. He still had allies by the end, but also does really mismanage his threat level to where he is the target by that point. So again, a bit of a mixed game. He should be credited for having a solid backing. It's just that obviously that backing was in the minority. So again, because of that, he's here at number 109. At number 108, we have someone a step better, I guess, and that is Greg from BB Can 3. And Greg was in a similar position of him being the figurehead for his alliance, though a difference is that Greg's alliance was actually the majority for a bit. Now, at the end of the day, he was the figurehead, so at the first point that the minority ends up winning an HOH, he becomes the clear, easy target, and that is exactly what happens here. But again, the fact that he had around half the house wanting to work with him is enough to land him above the last few two he talked about, and that alliance did hold control for a few weeks is enough to put him here at 108. At 107, we're going back to BB Can 8 with a player that I don't know really what to do with, and that is Chris Wiley. And Chris is a tough player to rank because, again, I really feel like this is one that would be largely determined on where we saw where his game ended up going. Now, based on where this season ended, it did seem like he was pretty much the biggest target for about half the house coming into the following week. But Chris did prove to be one of the better challenge competitors of the season, probably second to Sheldon. So it wouldn't be that surprising if he would be able to win a decent amount of comps moving forward. However, beyond that, again, was just pretty bad socially within the house, was not well liked or respected by a lot of the other players. Also seemed to be kind of aloof in the game, to where he was kind of being used as a weapon by a lot of the house. Again, like, I think it would have been easier to rank if we knew exactly where his game landed, but without that knowledge, again, it was a bit hazy on where exactly to put him, but I did end up putting him at 107. Now, number 106, we're moving on to finally another of the two-time players. This one being a person I'm kind of surprised with this hard, and that is Dallas from BB Can 4 and 5. And Dallas is a tough player to rank because obviously he had two pretty bad performances. I mean, his BB Can 4 performance is a pre-jury boot, but actually I don't think it's that bad of a game. I mean, yes, he's on the bottom for a lot of it, to where he is essentially the leader of the minority alliance for a lot of the game, and ends up failing in a lot of the things that he tries to do. But also, I feel like Dallas is actually not that bad of a strategic thinker across that season. I feel like he had somewhat decent reads and knew what he should be doing. It's just that he didn't have the social capital in order to execute those things. But he obviously gets pitted against the Jared and Kelsey's of the world, where a lot of his allies go home early on to perpetuate that war. But again, he continues to vote incorrectly. Due to him being left on the outs, he doesn't vote out Paige, he doesn't vote out Christine, he doesn't vote out Levita. Though eventually in his boot round ends up being a very interesting vote where he had a good chunk of numbers backing him. I mean, he was able to get the Pax Bros and Cassandra and Tim to actually fight for him to stay. The problem is that he did have the likes of Mitch actively campaigning against him, and he ends up obviously losing the battle there. But it's not like an absolute terrible game. BB Can 5 is obviously a weird one to assess, considering he is the second boot, and he is the second boot largely due to his own actions of getting too closely aligned to the likes of Dylan, in a position where Dimitri's is actively targeting that group. But at the same time, it's like, I don't think he does that much wrong to end up being the backdoor target there. So again, it's like, while on paper his game is really, really bad, I don't think it's actually as bad as what it seems like, though it's obviously still not good. He's still a 2-time early boot. But again, I felt like it was enough to land him here at 106. At 105 is probably the definitive of games that look really bad on paper. Or again, like this person's talked about as one of the worst players in history show. Again, I have him slightly above that. At 105, we do have Kyle Moore from BB Can 10. And this Kyle Moore obviously has a catastrophic downfall. I mean, the way that he completely blows up his game through his HOH week is really historic, where he literally comes into that week being the best position player in the game. He was set up to completely run the rest of the season. He was placed in the middle of the entire power structure and had done really impressive work across the first 2 weeks to set that up. But then he just blows it all up in week 3 and then proceeds to be backdoored by his own closest ally in week 4. It really is a season of two tales for him, and the fact that his first half is very, very impressive. However, his back half is astronomically bad. So again, where do you reconcile that? Again, for me, I decided to put him here, and that's largely because I do think he actually still has a lot of potential in the game of Big Brother. Again, the fact that he was able to get the stranglehold that he was in that first 2 weeks is extremely impressive. I do feel like if he were to play again, I do feel like he would be able to learn from those mistakes and probably play a pretty decent game. The problem is that he got a bit too tunnel vision and the paranoia got to him to where I feel like that completely sabotaged his game. I don't think he's the worst player in the world, largely because, again, the impressiveness of those first 2 weeks. So because that, he's here at 105. At number 104, we're moving back to BB Can 4. And here we actually have one of the later boots that we've talked about so far. And here we do have Maddie. And Maddie is a player that, again, I just feel like overall is pretty bad. I mean, the reason she is this high is because she did have a decent amount of comp ability. She did win 2 HOHs, but even within those HOHs, she made pretty suboptimal moves. I mean, in one of them, she took out Levita, who was a number for her at that point. In her other HOH, she really just does the dirty work of the rest of the house and follows that up with being the consensus target in the round following. So again, like, it's not that good there. Also, like Dallas, she's on the bottom for a lot of the game. She loses a lot of her allies early on. She survives the vote against Dallas, but again, not really due to anything that she was doing. It's more so due to the campaigning of Mitch. And outside of that, again, like, just played a very mediocre game to where she had no respect. I don't think she could win the game. It's because that she's here at 104. Now at 103, we're moving on to a person I just mentioned. Here we do have Levita from BB Can 4. And I do feel like Levita has a terrible game on paper. I think when you're looking at it, she was the first HOH and her pawn ends up going home there. She's then on the block week 2 and only gets saved due to the notion of wanting to keep the big threats around. Week 3, she wins HOH and fails to get her target out once again, where Christine goes home instead of Cassandra. And again, all of her game up until that point is pretty bad. However, I actually feel like her last week in the game was actually kind of good, to where she does do a lot of repairing of her relationships, to where she's able to build a really strong bond with the likes of Joel and Dallas, and they do fight for her to stay at the very end. Now, at the end of the day, she does really mismanage her threat level, which does cause her to be backdoored by Maddie in a position where, again, it's completely against Maddie's best interest. But again, like, I actually feel like she was playing decently well by that point in the game. It's just that her earlier mistakes come up to bite her. So I think Levita's kind of another one of these players that if she were to play again, I actually would feel decently well about her. But again, like, considering the faults in her game, I can't put her too highly. She's here at 103. At 102, we're moving on to probably the biggest name of the group of players that we've talked about so far. This being one of the biggest characters in the show's history up to this point, and someone I would fully expect to see play again. But at 102, we do have Victoria from BB Can 9. And again, Victoria to me played such an actively bad game. And the edit obviously props her up as a good player, but that is simply just not the case. I mean, weeks 1 and 2, she's kind of left outside of the power structure, not really knowing what she's doing. Week 3, she wins HOH and does make a good move there in getting rid of Latoya. Her optimal move in that position, but again, the way that she does it just further puts a target on her back. She then wins the secret HOH in week 5 and proceeds to target her closest allies in Austin and Brayden in a position where she's really banking on working with Ty and Jed moving forward. However, Ty and Jed simply have no loyalty to her, and we see that reciprocated immediately afterwards, where Beth wins HOH and Ty and Jed are willing to let her go, and Victoria ends up going home. It is a really, really bad game. Again, a game filled with her being either out of the loop or making suboptimal moves. However, I feel like the one thing to credit her for is the fact that she was good at competitions, and also the fact that she does kind of come close to staying, though, I mean, I really give that to more so of just Ty, Jed, and Beth not being able to make a decision to save themselves. But either way, I mean, Victoria does have minor pros, but I do think the rest of her game is pretty bad. But because of that, she's here at 102. At 101, moving back to BB Can 8 with another player. I don't know what to do with this person. Here we do have Jamar from BB Can 8, who obviously gets ejected from the game in week 3. However, I feel like before that, he was playing fine. Like, he was kind of this floater in the middle of the house that was not really part of any major alliances, but I feel like was not a target by anyone, had a decent amount of good social relationships, and could have been well positioned if it wasn't for the fact that he got a bit too heated at points that obviously led to him putting a bigger target on himself. But even then, it wasn't even a guarantee that he was going to go home soon. Though, again, like at the end of the day, he was outside the core power structure. I don't really see him doing that well moving forward, but we never really got to see it fully. Like, we really just don't know exactly where his game would have landed, and considering him having some solid play early on, I did decide to land him at 101. Now, at number 100, top 100 BB Can players. Here we have probably one of the more boring ones. We're at Marin from BB Can 6. And, I mean, he was there. He was taken out in a split vote, largely propelled by Johnny and Paris, who wanted to save Ryan. There isn't really much that he did in the game, but the reason he is this high is because I don't think he ever would have been able to do that much in the game. Again, he is not one of these players that did come into the game late, and through that did have inherent issues with Ozzy being looked at as a late entrant, and through that wasn't going to be able to build up those relationships unless he was a truly elite player, and really he's not. But again, I do think the disadvantage that he was given to begin with does end up landing him here at number 100. Now, number 99, moving on to a string of earlier boots in the game, but players that did end up having some potential in the game. At number 99, we do have Chelsea Bird from BB Can 7. And Chelsea is a player that, to me, has the major mistake of obviously not managing her threat level that well, to where the Pretty Boys did look at her as the biggest threat out of the non-Pretty Boys, and through that decided to target her immediately after her HOH, where she really just did the bidding for the Pretty Boys. And all that is pretty bad. However, I think she was also harmed by the fact that she was on the season with the Pretty Boys, to where I feel like on most other seasons, she would be a somewhat competent player. I mean, she did seem to be good at really all three facets of the game. The obvious issue is the fact that she was mismanaging her threat level, and again, at the end of the day, that's really an issue of all the players we're about to talk about. So because that, she's here at number 99. Now, number 98, a player that kind of gets screwed over, but also, again, mismanaged her threat level up to that point. And at number 98, we do have Neha from BB Can 3. And again, similar case to Chelsea, just I feel like got a bit more screwed over. Was a player that came off as the biggest threat, not in the core power structure. Was a very strategically active player, but again, was in the minority for the game up to that point, and really gets taken out in an instant eviction that who would have known what would have happened had that not been an instant eviction. Now we do know that while she did campaign to Kevin and Kevin did seem receptive, I believe Kevin has confirmed that he still would have targeted Neha anyway in that position. Though, again, obviously, like, what would have happened with the veto? And beyond that, if she had survived the round, I do think there would have been a decent amount of potential for her moving forward, with her having a decent amount of potential allies. So, again, like, I feel like there is a lot of potential in Neha. It's just that we didn't get to see it. And she does get kind of screwed over, which puts her above Chelsea for me at 98. At 97, another player that really mismanages threat level, but also had some backing by the time he went home, and that person is Hamza. And Hamza is an extremely messy player. I mean, he's aligned with the Ryan and Andrews of the world while they're on the bottom, but then wins HOH in week 3 and could have used it to solidify himself in the power structure, but instead it comes off as an extremely chaotic presence, to where he later becomes a further target because of that chaotic presence. But he still does end up taking out one of the bigger targets on the board in Jesse, though again, the way that he does it is very flawed. But again, moving forward, he does have a decent amount of allies. He has the likes of an Erica and a Will and a Marin and a Veronica. It's like he has these people that do want to keep him around, but he eventually gets taken out during the double, where again, we do see Johnny put a lot of work in convincing Olivia to backdoor him there, but still in a position where he had the likes of Erica fighting for him to stay and didn't want him to go. And while he does massively mismanage his threat level, I feel like that stuff is enough to land him here at number 97. Now, number 96, another player completely mismanages threat level, though also gets screwed over by Canada. And here we do have Andrew Gordon from BB Can 2. And Andrew is a player that really takes control from the very beginning. He becomes the leader of the first 5 and becomes the clear figurehead for that group. Again, completely mismanaging his threat level there. However, his eventual boot is again perpetuated by Canada, to where I really, who knows what would have happened with the HOH that week if it was not for Canada's vote, to where Andrew might have been the target anyway, but obviously it's made it a lot easier for the likes of the sloppy seconds to come together and take him out. Also along the way, again, does have a decent amount of allies that, again, do eventually turn on him, but through that and also his relationship with Allison, he has these things going for him. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 96. On number 95, we have a player that is extremely unlikable. However, just purely basing it off of gameplay, I do have to land him this high, and at number 95, we do have Kyle from BB Can 8. And again, Kyle gets expelled from the game due to his actions and the way he treated Jamar. And again, all that's very icky. However, looking at it from a pure gameplay standpoint, he was a major figure within the Majority Alliance up to that point. I mean, him and Sheldon really dictated a lot of the game up to that point, and he was being used as a figurehead for that group. Again, obviously, a problem stems from the fact that he was also very unlikable, to where I don't think he would win a jury vote if he got to the end in most situations. But the fact that he was able to have as much control as he did and had the likes of Sheldon fighting for him to stay in positions where other people wanted Sheldon to take Kyle out, I do think that is decent gameplay there. So again, looking at a purely game perspective, he does end up being relatively high here at number 95. Now at number 94, we're moving on to a player that also mismanages threat level, but is also a player that did seem to have some potential, and that is Johnny from BB Can 3. And Johnny seemed to be a decent strategic thinker. I mean, obviously, he was a big fan of their show. He seemed to be good at competitions as well. However, at the end of the day, he was initially left outside the Majority Alliance and ends up becoming one of the bigger threats outside the Majority Alliance, so where he becomes an easy target by the time he goes home. So again, that's obviously not great. But I do think the level of potential that he demonstrated, while also being a very affable figure to where most of the house liked him, despite looking at him as the biggest threat, is enough to land him here at number 94. Now, number 93, we're moving on to a string of players here that made somewhat deeper runs, but were just extremely passive players along the way. At number 93, we are starting it off with Nikki Graham from BB Can 4, which, firstly, rest in peace, Nikki Graham. But beyond that, again, was largely just there. I mean, obviously an incredible character for the show, but in terms of her gameplay, she just wasn't really playing the game that actively. I mean, she's really a moldable presence to where the likes of Tim and Mitch were really fighting for control over her vote. And really, she was just an easy person to drag through the game in a position where, I don't know if she could win a jury vote. I don't think they would have awarded her the win, and was also still not even taken to the very end, where she was taken out over Joel. Though to be fair, there is some unlucky circumstances surrounding that as well. But again, due to how passive she was in the game, she's here at number 93. At number 92, another extremely passive presence, but at least one that probably win more competitions. And at 92, we do have Rochelle from BB Can 2. And again, Rochelle to me, also extremely passive, made moves that weren't in her best interest, namely getting rid of Ika, who wanted to work with Rochelle. Through that, she was kind of lumped in with the first 5 and worked alongside them moving forward, even though they lost control immediately after that. It ends up being on the bottom alongside Sabrina towards the end of the game, where she's taken out as the bigger physical threat. Again, it's an extremely passive game with some poor moves, but again, at least she could win competitions, so that's something. She's here at number 92. At 91, moving on to another extremely passive player in the game, but this one I think was at least slightly more involved in alliances and had more relationships, and that person is Esty from BB Can 7. Really, it's at the end of the day, she did have good relationships with Dane, had a good relationship with Kiki, had a good relationship with Damien, was one of the last standing of the non-pretty boys, largely due to her relationship with Dane, though also actually gets taken out before Damien because of her relationship with Dane. But again, it's another one of these victims of the pretty boys, to where I think this was just an abnormal situation for BB Can, to where had she been correct in actually being Dane's number 2, I do feel like that would put Esty a decent amount higher on this list. And in most situations, Dane should have been loyal to the likes of Esty over the likes of an Anthony and an Adam, who were much bigger threats. But I think she gets unlucky with how the season played out, but also was just extremely passive throughout a lot of it, so really a lot of it's her own fault anyways. Again, not too highly ranked here due to her passive gameplay, and she's here at number 91. Now number 90, and this is another really tough one to assess from BBCan 8, and here we do have Maddie, and I don't really know what to do with her, where I feel like she is one of the bigger question marks of all of BBCan 8, where she's a player that played really poorly off the bat, was in the minority, was looked at as a target, but beyond that, won a veto, so she's somewhat decent in competitions, and also started to pick up a bit in her game. Not really to any extreme, again, she was still like not the best position in the world, but it did seem like she was picking up the game a bit. However, again, like we just don't see how the story would have played out, and because that, it makes it tough to assess. But again, based on the flaws of her early game, and how she wasn't all the way there in repairing those, I did leave her here at number 90. Now, number 89, we're going from one Maddie to another. We're moving on to Maddie from BBCan 6. And this Maddie is a tough one to rank as well, largely because of the fact that she was kind of outside of the core power structure for a lot of the game. While she did have good relationships with Paris and Will, to where they had a final 3 by the end game, she was kind of just there for a lot of the early game. As a very expendable person, and even in the end game where her alliance starts to gain a bit of power, she does make some questionable moves with that, where I do think she starts to play a lot more for the alliance than her own personal game, and also takes a suboptimal path for her specifically, in my eyes, of siding with Derek and Kayla over Allie and Olivia. To where I feel like that route in particular would have been a better one for Maddie, and ends up going out in a position where she kind of just sacrifices her game for Paris, not really even trying to stay at that point. So again, it's a very middling game, was left outside of the core power structure for a lot of it, and even when they had some power, I don't really agree with some of the decision making she made, so because of that, she's here at number 89. Now number 88, another extremely passive player, but one that I think played less actively bad, and at 88 we do have Peely from BBCan 3, and again, Peely extremely passive for a lot of the game, though was in a core alliance for more of the game, where she did have the Diaper Alliance that held a lot of control through the mid game, and also again, like, just didn't make as big of mistakes throughout the game, mainly because she was playing a lot less than someone like a Maddie from BBCan 6. But through that, they both end up being in a similar position, where they're both taken out at the final 5, both in positions where they are very unlikely to win a jury vote. So really, I look at their games kind of similarly. It's just that, again, I feel like Peely was in a bigger alliance for longer, and also did less actively wrong. So because of that, she's here number 88. At number 87, moving on to, I believe, the first runner-up of this list, and here we do have Karen from BBCan 5. And again, Karen's a person that had no win equity, was never winning a game against anybody outside of, again, maybe Ica if there was enough bitterness, or even like a Dylan, but even beyond that, played suboptimally considering those routes, where again, she never really played to even try to win the game, which again does have a level of self-awareness to it, but also again, she sabotages the only chances of her potentially winning the game, and largely does it under the guise of her wanting to spite Kevin Martin more so than her making an actual game move. Now, I do think there's some credit to attribute to her for the fact that she targets 2 big guys in week 1, and despite that, it's not really a target beyond that, unlike what we had seen from the likes of Pop and Paul Jackson or a Suzette. So at least there's some credit to give her there, but again, considering her complete lack of win equity and then also her suboptimal moves, she's here at number 87. Now number 86, moving back to BBCan 8 with someone that, again, don't know what to do with this person, but here we do have Rianne. And I could definitely see the argument that Maddie should be higher than Rianne, when realistically looking at their games, I do think Maddie had a lot more potential moving forward in BBCan 8 than Rianne did, where Rianne is someone that was already called out as a big threat and would have potentially been a boot within the next couple rounds. However, I will give Rianne a bit of credit for being that threat that people talked about. Like, she is a very good social player. She is very good at building relationships with people, building one-on-one bonds. The problem is that she does it in a way that makes people feel threatened by her, in them recognizing how good she is socially, without them actually wanting to build a strategic bond with them. Which again, I think is a massive issue when it comes to Rianne, of her getting the target of being a social player without actually getting the true benefits of being a social player. Now, I do think part of that can be attributed to this cast. I do feel like on other seasons it might have been effective, but it wasn't on the season that we saw, and because of that, I don't know exactly where to land her, but I'm going to put her here at number 86. Now, number 85, we have a player that I look at very similarly from a couple seasons later. And here we do have Tanisha from BB Can 10. Again, is another player that is very good socially. However, not good enough to where those social bonds turned into strategic bonds. She is a very affable presence and one that can easily make relationships. However, one that kind of isolated a lot of people, again, like Rianne, kind of stuck to her own group, and through that made the people that are not in her group recognize how social she is being in her own group, to where they look at her as a threat, as a social threat, but also, again, not being the strategic glue that she was perceived to be. And I do think as a whole, again, Tanisha has very similar flaws to the likes of Rianne, to where she was looked at as the biggest threat from her alliance, despite the fact that she just wasn't. But again, I do think Tanisha has some potential. I do think she demonstrates some good social ability across her season. It's just that she utilized it in a bit of a misguided way, but again, it's still good enough for her to land here at number 85. Now, number 84, moving on to another player from BB Can 10, and here we do have Moose. And Moose is a player that, to me, played a very messy early game, being kicked out of the majority alliance because of how obvious he was being with this strategizing, gets targeted by Kyle largely due to this in week 3, despite it being a terrible move for Kyle, was obviously able to win the veto and survive that round in a position where he was more than likely going home if he was still on the block. And he ends up playing a pretty decent game moving forward, having a solid backing, being part of an alliance with Tanisha and Summer and Betty and Josh and Herman. The problem is that none of those people were truly loyal to him in the game, and he still is looked at as a threat and ends up being pretty expendable by his eventual boot week. But again, I feel like there is still some potential there. I feel like if Moose were to play again, I feel like he can learn from his mistakes, and I feel like he could be a very competent player. But based on what we saw, I feel like 84 is the highest I can go with him. Now, number 83, moving on to a player that I do think gets twist screwed. However, outside of that, I do think plays pretty suboptimally, but her being twist screwed puts her a bit higher on the list. At 83, we do have Corey from BB Can 7. Now, along with the twist screwing, I will also mention that Corey was also a late entrant, and the fact that she was able to build such a strong bond with Anthony and be part of his long-term plans, despite being a late entrant, is kind of impressive. But beyond that, I think she really just becomes such a mobile presence for Anthony, to where she obviously ends up being the one that backdoors Sam in a position where that is completely against her best interest, but does so because Anthony wants her to. Though again, she is booted in her eventual boot round because of a twist. If it was not for the secret assassin twist, she would not be on the block, though that obviously ends up leading to her downfall there, which is again very unlucky in a position where again it seemed like Anthony was poised to run the game before that and be at the center of the majority alliance, while instead that move makes it so it's more so Dane that's in the center of everything. And again, leaves Corey as the biggest threat outside of the pretty boys. So again, I think there's some unlucky circumstances there, but again, not enough to put her much higher than 83 here. Now, number 82, we're moving on to a player that made it very far into the season and had a lot of win equity by the end. The problem is that they played the first 2/3 of the season really terribly, and that person is Tara from BB Can 9. And Tara is a player that is a very active player. I mean, despite her being looked at as a GOAT from very early on, she is a player that keeps on trying to do things. I mean, she has a final 2 with Tina from very early on, and they really play the middle of the game for a lot of it. However, they end up siding with the losing side. They end up siding with the Kyle and Rose of the world, when it is the Jed and Ty side of things that are really holding a lot of the control through their accomplices comp wins, to where it kind of nullifies the work that Tara is doing early on, to where she even has like actively poor play in that her campaigning to save Kyle ends up actually putting a bigger target on Kyle's back, which shows her lack of awareness there. She was the target at the final 9 round. Through the early jury phase of the game, she was looked at as a pretty big target that was able to get through comp wins, / Victoria being looked at as a big threat. Even the Jed backdoor, which was looked at as a move to prop her up. I mean, even there, she plays suboptimally by nominating Brayden as a pawn in a position where Brayden could have gone home, and Brayden was one of her closer allies at that point. So again, that was even bad. And then she gets voted out and has to come back into the game. So again, all that is pretty bad. But she was one competition from winning the game. Based on what we know from the jury, she would have beaten both Ty and Brayden. And despite me thinking that her voting off Kiefer at the final 4 is a bad move, in the sense that it decreases the chance of her getting to the end, it technically put her in a position where she was one competition away from winning. So it's like, again, rocky game here at number 82. Now, number 81, another player from BB Can 9. Here we do have Beth. And Beth is a player that I feel like the edit propped up as a better player than what she actually was. Again, another player that was pretty actively bad at points in the game, put a further target on her back early on, where despite being in the majority alliance, was not a well-respected member of that majority alliance, and she obviously makes the move to backdoor Victoria, which was her optimal move, but the complete wavering that she was doing the entire way, and the fact that she almost flips the vote at the very last second is very asinine as well. She ends up playing a role in the Kiefer backdoor, only for them to not go through with it, and then also letting Jed go home, which was suboptimal for her game. And while she survives the initial final 5 round, she's then taken out immediately after that. So largely due to the amount of scheming that she was doing, and also the fact that she was upset at Ty, and like all this is pretty poor play. Again, like I do not look at Beth as that good of a player, but considering her deep run this season, the fact that it did look like she had some win equity, I do have her here at number 81. Now number 80, moving on to a player that was a lot more passive in the game, but still had a deep run to where they had a decent amount of win equity, and that person is Damien from BB Can 7, who, again, like I think is a person that was very well liked by the jury. Like, I don't know if they would have rewarded him the win over the likes of Adam or Dane, but against anyone else, I do think he would have been a likely winner. The problem is that obviously he was anywhere close to getting to the end there, though I think also gets unlucky in the fact that he doesn't. I think the fact that he was included in the Pretty Boys is something that actually is funnily due to Canada voting for him in the preseason to be the first to enter the house and be able to watch everyone else. Where if it had not been for that, then Damien would have probably been involved in the Pretty Boys over Mark, as he did gel with that group a lot more. But because of his exclusion there, he ends up being taken out before the end game. But beyond that, I mean, he is an extremely passive player. I mean, he had relationships with a lot of the earlier boots and Kaylin and Maki. He had relationships with Kiki and Esty, though those really went nowhere for his game. He even ends up falling into Dane's trap of being the deciding vote to vote out Esty. It's like, again, there's not much positive to really say about his game outside of his win equity and how unlucky he was to not be in the Pretty Boys, but it's still not an entirely bad game, so he's here number 80. Now, number 79, we're moving on to another person that was kind of screwed over to a degree, but this one to a bigger degree. At 79, we do have AJ from BB Can 1, who is obviously the first victim of the instant eviction, which ends up being a very unlucky circumstance for him, where he's nominated against Andrew in a position where Emmett uses his influence to get Peter and Alec to go against their best interest in voting out AJ over Andrew. But I think this is a situation where I think he gets extremely unlucky that it is an instant eviction. If it was not an instant eviction, I do think the likes of Peter and Alec would have been able to think about it more to where they would potentially want to keep him. I also feel like the fact that Topaz's talking in the HOH room got leaked, which was also very messy from production. I do think that led to Peter and Alec also not wanting to work with Topaz to where they wrote out AJ here. So I feel like there's a lot of like circumstances that weren't in his control that were very unlucky for him. But at the same time, he was really the perpetual pawn of the season, to where I don't know how much win equity he would have had anyway, but he does still get screwed over. So I put him here at number 79. At number 78, we're moving on to a player that had very little agency throughout the game, but they almost won the game, and that person is Tala from BB Can 1. And Tala is a person that had a lot of win equity by the end of the game. I mean, in the natural game layout where the final 4 was Jillian, Emmett, Andrew, and Tala, more than likely Andrew is going to be the boot at 4, and through that, if Tala had just one final HOH, she would have won the game. And even in the real life scenario, again, she was at final 4 in a position where she was also very close to winning the game had she gone to the end with Jillian, which was her plan. The problem is that Tala is Tala, and none of that was active. It was all her being a very emotional player and her really being kept around as a perceived non-threat. So again, like, I don't know how much credit to really give her for a lot of things, but the fact that she was towards the end with a lot of win equity is enough to put her at 78 here. Now, number 77, we're moving on to another really late endgamer. So the next runner-up on the board, and here we do have Sabrina from BB Can 2, who played a pretty bad game by the end of it. I mean, didn't have any win equity, was going to lose against everybody, was not respected by any of the jury. However, the one positive is the fact that she did have a decent amount of control early on, and where she was part of the first 5, and along with Andrew, was looked at as the figurehead of that alliance. She did a lot more of the active work, especially in maintaining the women's side of things. Like, she does do decent work early on, I do think you have to give her credit for, but at the end of the day, it's like, considering she ends up being on the bottom once the first 5 breaks up, and then loses a jury vote against anybody, it's tough to really credit her too much, but she's here at number 77. Now, number 76. We have 2 BB Can 8 players in a row here. 2 players that had a rough start, but both started to pick up the game quite a bit by the end and were solidly positioned at the time the season ended. And first, we're starting it off at 76 with John Luke. And John Luke, again, starting to pick up the game a bit by the end. Again, initially he was aligned with Michael, Rianne, and Maddie, and still had the likes of Maddie and Rianne wanting to work with him by the end of his run. But again, it starts off rough to where they're on the bottom, they lose Michael. But beyond that, he's able to build a very strong relationship with Brooke and Sheldon to where they wanted to work with him moving forward. And just in general, started to talk a lot more game. And I do think there was a decent amount of potential with John Luke had the season not ended there. I do think John Luke was someone that Sheldon and Brooke intended to bring along for a few more rounds, where at that point, who knows if he just starts to win a whole bunch of comps. Like, I do think John Luke had a decent amount of potential, and that's why he's here number 76. And at number 75, again, another person in a similar category, and here we do have Hira from BB Can 8. Now, I do think Hira was probably in a worse position than John Luke. I think John Luke did better work socially to ingrain himself within the powers that be. However, Hira, I think, has two massive advantages to John Luke. One is the fact that I think he's probably more likable, to where I think he's more naturally inclined to win a jury vote due to the fact that he is this very kind person who is also this family man. I feel like it's tough to not award him the win. But also beyond that, Hira just demonstrated a lot more comp ability, to where we obviously see Hira win 2 vetoes along the way. He seemed to have a bit more ability to win potential future comps. Also, I feel like Hira's a player that we start to see a bit more of a cutthroat nature from him by the end. Like, while John Luke was better at positioning, I feel like Hira is the type of player that I would be more confident in making the moves that are necessary by the end game. And even beyond that, he was not that poorly positioned. Again, no one was targeting him at that point in the game. Mind you, I do think that target was probably going to come up within a few weeks. But again, considering we didn't get to see any of that, and I do feel like he did have a decent amount of potential moving forward, I do have him at number 75. Now, number 74, the halfway point in the list, we're starting it off with another player that we didn't get to see the proper end to his game, and that comes from Ramsey from BB Can 4. And Ramsey, again, is a tough player to assess here. Again, one that had to quit the game due to the health of his father, and also becomes tough to assess because he really wasn't doing that much in the game. I mean, he was not a very active player, and in most aspects, I mean, he was very similar to the likes of Dallas and Maddie. That was his alliance, and he was working alongside them for a lot of the game. However, he was probably the best of the 3 in competitions, and we even see in his round where he quits, he was on the block, but he does win the veto to take himself off. So it's like, he does seem to have a decent amount of comp ability. He does seem to be someone that was well liked. I don't know if they respected his game necessarily. But again, like, overall, he just feels like a very middling player. But really, who knows how the game would have played out if he stayed. And because of that, he is here at 74. Now, number 73, moving on to a player that I actually probably have more downsides for than Ramsey. But also, I feel like the ceiling is a lot higher. And that person is Rohan. And Ro is a player that, again, demonstrated a decent amount of potential. I mean, he is a very strategic guy. He seems to get the basic strategy of the game, but he also had some misguided strategy at points, and also was largely unsuccessful in a lot of the things that he tried to do. I mean, he gets himself on the block in week 2 in a position where there were talks about flipping the vote on him, and then proceeds to lose a lot of his allies after the Latoya vote in Kyle and Austin, winning vetoes along the way that increase his threat level to the point where he is booted at the first opportunity immediately afterwards. And again, for me, it's like a very middling game. Again, there definitely is potential there. Like, I would have a decent amount of confidence in Ro if he were to return to the game, but based on the game he played the first time around, again, a pretty middling game that lands him here at number 73. Now, number 72, and now we're getting to a batch of some of the better early boots in BB Can. All these players were booted before the 4th round of the game, but I do think they all had very weird circumstances leading up to their boots. At 72 here, we're starting it off with Anil from BB Can 1, who is a player that is on the bottom of this group largely because, like, he was on the bottom of the game. I mean, even from the beginning, he was someone that sketched people out to where no one really wanted to work with him, but he was able to do some decent work in building relationships with the likes of Liza and Jillian to where they end up wanting to keep him around. He also builds a strong enough bond with Tom to where Tom doesn't target him right away. However, he does get massively screwed by Canada, where they end up saving Suzette, leading to Anil having to be backdoored and taken out of the game at that point. And again, that was just extremely unlucky for Anil. Now, again, at the end of the day, he did not build strong enough relationships with the likes of an Emmett, who was targeting him right from the beginning, and also the likes of the Shield. But, I mean, there was no way he was going But, I mean, he was safe for that round. I do think, depending on the HOH, he could have survived the following round as well. And then at that point, who really knows where it would have gone? So I do think he gets screwed over to a degree. But considering his spot already at the bottom of the game at the point that he does get screwed over, I do have him here at 72. Now, number 71, moving on to a player that doesn't really get screwed over, but I do think gets very unlucky in circumstances that lead to their eventual boot. At 71, I do have LaToya from BB Can 9, who, again, it's funny that she's above a lot of the people that leave after her on the season. But I do think LaToya, again, gets pretty unlucky with how the game played out. I mean, she does go home to a Victoria HOH, who was pretty much the only person that was going to target LaToya. Most people were out to target Jed or Ty out of their group. However, Victoria was one of the only people not on their side that did want to keep Jed and Ty around. I do think that's a bit of unluckiness from LaToya. And then before that, it's like she was in a pretty solid spot. I mean, I think she was the more rational player out of her alliance, where, again, you have the likes of Ty, Jed, and Beth, who are all extremely scatterbrained in the game. I do think LaToya was a more stable presence, though that did obviously make her a bit more threatening as well. And obviously there is still a lack of threat management by the end of it, but I do think LaToya is a solid player despite her early boot and is here at 71. Now, number 70, same thing. Another person gets pretty unlucky by the HOH result, and that person is Jesse from BB Can 6, who, again, I think on paper is a very well-rounded player. I think he's a player that is good strategically, good socially, and is pretty physical. And coming into that round, there wasn't really anyone targeting Jesse. However, I do think he gets kind of unlucky that Hamza ends up winning HOH. Hamza, who is an extremely chaotic figure, and that does eventually lead to Jesse's downfall. Now, again, like, could he have played that round better? Probably. But for me, I think out of the early boots from BB Can, I find the least amount of flaws with Jesse's game, to where for me he lands here number 70. Now, number 69, again, I believe the earliest boot left on the board, and here we are going to BB Can 9, and here we have Kyle Moore. And I feel like for most people this might come out of left field. I feel like people talk about Kyle Moore from BB Can 9 pretty negatively, but in reality, I feel like he is probably one of the better players on the season. I think he is one of the most stable forces on a very chaotic season. Again, on a season where you have the likes of Jed and Ty and Beth, who constantly change their minds left and right. You had the likes of Kiefer and Victoria, who had very misguided strategic ideas. You have even Roe, who is a bit all over the place. You have Braden and Austin, who are extremely passive in the game. It's like, when we have this really strange field of players, I do think Kyle Moore ends up being one of the best people in that field. I mean, I think he seemed to know what he was doing the most, though even then, obviously there are flaws here. I mean, his treatment of Kiefer in particular is a massive flaw, which does end up leading to his eventual boot. But even in that position, he had people fighting for him to stay. He had around half the house wanting him to stay, with the likes of Tina and Tara having flipped against their former alliance to side with him, and having Tara campaign for him, though also Tara's campaign for him did harm him. But again, like, he had a very solid group of allies, to where really I think the only way he goes home, to where, again, like, he technically had the numbers. Like, he was technically in the majority at that point over the likes of Jed and Ty. It's obviously that the HOH greatly disfavored him, and he was on the block against Austin, who would have had the vote of Braden automatically anyway. While I feel like if he was against Roe, as it was initially intended to be, I do feel like Roe would probably go home in that situation. So yeah, I feel like Kyle gets very unlucky in how things played out, and it was also one of the more stable presences across the season that do leave him at 69 here. Now, number 68, and now we're moving on to people who made it a bit further into the game, but were deeply flawed at the game. At 68, we're moving on to BB Can 6, and here we do have Will. And Will is a very conflicting personality to me. I feel like Will is a player that had some good gameplay at points. I mean, early in the game, he was pretty much in the center of a lot of the game, where he had relationships with people in a lot of the different groups. Again, in a season that was very dynamic in how the house laid out. However, I do think the more and more the season goes on, he starts to lose a lot of that agency, where he loses the likes of Veronica and Hamza and Erica, his relationship with Johnny money gets severed. And it's like, by the time he gets to the end game, he's kind of fully reliant on the Paris Maddie trio. And at that point also has very little win equity. So obviously that is like a major issue there. Then obviously at the final 5, he throws the veto in a position where his group needed him to win the veto, and that's really bad as well. And again, like, there is a lot of mediocrity across the game, but I do think there was a point where he was well positioned, so that leaves him high enough to be at 68 here. Now, number 67, we're moving on to a player that gets so lucky in the game, so lucky that he was a part of an alliance that he had no right to be in, and that is Mark from BBCan 7, who is obviously the 4th pretty boy, and again, was largely just lumped into the alliance because they felt like they needed a 4th guy. I don't feel like Mark really contributed much to the alliance or the success of the alliance. He was largely just there, but he was part of the alliance, so that's something, I guess. He did get the final 5. Mind you, he had like no win equity, where the only person he beats is Kira, but even despite that, he is still booted at final 5. So again, all that's pretty bad. Very mediocre player, very misguided strategy, and really so moldable by Anthony by the time of the end game. And so warped on his like vendetta against Adam that I do think it stirred him away from some options as well. So again, like, overall, I really do not look at Mark as that good of a player, but considering his placement and in connection to the Pretty Boys, he's here at number 67. Now number 66, another player don't look at too highly, but he made it relatively far, and that person is Bobby from BBCan 3. And again, another player, don't really have that much faith in his overall game ability, but he is a pretty good competitor. Definitely had ability to win comps. He was decent socially, where like everyone liked him, but not really to any extreme. I mean, like, he's pretty much just a very average player in my eyes. Middling strategically, where like he had to be really forced into voting out Jordan, which was the best move for him at that point. Game was kind of all over the place, but seems like a well-rounded enough player to be here at number 66. Now, number 65, we're jumping forward to the most recent season of the show. Another player that's kind of a bit more difficult to rank. Not 100% sure on where exactly this person should land. At number 65, we do have Marty from BBCan 10, who ends up being one of the better competition competitors on the season. He wins a lot of the comps up until his boot, but what he did with those comps was very questionable. He definitely had a lot of questionable strategic decisions, ranging from blindsiding half the house with his Renom in week 2 to flipping on Kyle and pretty much putting all the blame of the flip on him, even though he was the last person to know. Flipping on Gino again and then lashing out when the plan doesn't go through, and really just burning his social relationships along the way. Like, it is a very mediocre game in terms of that, but again, his comp ability was pretty strong, and also he had a lot of win equity, where by the time he was booted, he was the biggest jury threat on the board. So despite all of his poor social play beforehand, I do think mixing in his comp ability with his jury management, and also him essentially trying to utilize the Kevin Martin strategy of just focusing on the competition, by that point, it kind of rectifies some of his missteps. But again, some really poor strategic decisions along the way that do leave him here at number 65. Now, number 64, moving on to a very similar player from the same season. We are moving on to Gino from BBCan 10, who, again, one of the better competitors of the season, won a decent amount of comps, but also extremely lucky, and also one that made some really dumb decisions along the way. I mean, unlike Marty, Gino was actually the best positioned along with Kyle in the early game. I mean, him and Kyle really ran those first 2 weeks due to almost nothing that Gino did. I mean, he was extremely passive participant and all that, but again, he was there. But again, once Kyle gets blindsided on, the fact that Gino is the one that actually take Kyle out himself is a very suboptimal move, getting rid of his closest ally and also a shield for him. He then is almost booted at the double, where if Jess had won that final competition, he would have gone home over Jason. Even beyond that, on the block against Jess, the vote was very close to flipping on him. Following that, he decides to try to target Marty in a position where Marty was actually loyal to him at that point, even though it's again still chaotic figure. But that was suboptimal. And then his eventual boot week, where he agrees to be in the running for the gummy bears, where he's eventually put on the block in a position where he goes home. Again, it's a lot of bad moves, but he is a very well-rounded player outside of his strategic ability, and also had a lot of win equity, so he's high enough to be here at 64. Now, number 63, we have the first winner we're going to be talking about, and we're starting it off here with the first of the Pax Bros. We do have Phil, and Phil just sucked. I mean, Phil was a pretty bad player. despite his eventual win. Like, obviously, just in general, the Pax Bros are looked at as one of the luckiest winners in BB Can, getting lucked out in certain situations and also winning a whole bunch of comps. But Phil is the luckier of the two in the sense that the comps that get them to the end are not even won by him. He does win a very integral veto, so at least there's credit there, but most of the other comps were won by his brother, and Phil himself just seemed like a very middling presence. Now, he was a more active strategic player than Nick, but he was also actively bad in that he would ruin relationships and make poor decisions for the duo. Like, Phil really is a pretty bad player despite being a winner, but it is the fact that he did win, I guess, that does leave him high enough here at number 63. Now, number 62, moving on to one of the last BB Can 8 people left on the board. Here we have Suzanne. And Sue actually seemed to be a solid player on the season, being one of the more social people on the board, and through that was able to get herself into numerous alliances. A major issue for me with Sue, though, is the fact that she was starting to get caught by the time that the season ended, where it did seem like the target was starting to grow on Sue's back, and that's obviously not great. But really by that point, I mean, there were a lot of targets for a lot of different people, to where, like, despite, the target growing on her back, it felt like there were other more apparent targets before her, and considering the impressive amount of game ability that she demonstrated at points across the season, again, it was enough for her to be here at 62. Number 61, we're moving on to one of the last BB Can 7 people on the board that isn't part of the Pretty Boys. Here we do have Sam. And again, like, for me, I feel like Sam is a player that could actually do pretty well if she wasn't on a season with the Pretty Boys. I actually feel like she played a decent game, and if it wasn't for the guiding of Adam, I do think she had somewhat correct reads on the game. But again, having Adam as part of the Pretty Boys obviously held her back, and really this is a placement more so based on potential than anything, but because I do have Sam here at number 61. At number 60, we have a player that really is this high because they got screwed over, and really that's the next few people we'll be talking about. But at number 60, I do have Topaz from BB Can 1, and really, like, again, is Topaz this high, realistically? Probably not. But again, like, a lot of her game's breakdown did seem to stem from the fact that they leaked her HOH conversation during the instant, which really led to the downfall of her game. And really the fact that her HOH ended up being an instant eviction was also extremely unlucky, as I do feel like that allowed for the Shield to have less time to recognize how big of a mistake they were making. But really outside of that, again, like, Topaz played a pretty middling game. I mean, she was aligned with Gary, had a 2 there, made like a side deal with Alex and Peter, but they were never truly loyal to her. And the fact that, again, they side with Emmett over her, I think is a massive indictment there. So again, overall, I'm not even like that high on Topaz as a player, but she did get kind of screwed over, so she's here at number 60. Number 59, another player that got screwed over, but this one even more so. We're at Willow from BB Can 3. And Willow's another, like, pretty middling player. I mean, unlike Topaz, I do think Willow was actually in the majority for a bit. She was in the chop shop. She had good relationships with really both sides of the house, and no one was really targeting her. However, she does get extremely unlucky in her eventual boot round, where one, she's the back door there in a position where Bruno had used the veto on Zach, which was completely out of left field. But also she gets backdoored by Brittany, who was Willow's closest ally, which, again, that's not great either. And really, she ends up getting voted out by accident, where Sarah accidentally votes her out due to not realizing that she would have the numbers. And again, all of that is just like really terrible circumstances, things that would have been avoided had this not been a really rushed triple. So again, I do think Willow gets largely unlucky. Then again, like, realistically, do I think Willow was winning the game? Not really. I don't think she was really set up to. I don't think she really had the respect to. But again, considering how unlucky her eventual boot is, she's here at 59. Now, number 58, we're moving on to another player that I think got largely unlucky, and that person is Allison from BB Can 2. Because I think Allison's a player that had a lot of potential. The problem is that they entered the game late, and through that had very little social capital in the game. Now, beyond that, again, like, obviously you can call out her move to not save Arlie. That was really, really terrible and really just game ending. But really, I mean, that's a situation where she just got outplayed by John and Netta, who are obviously way higher on this list. But I think just in general, I think her overall game was severely harmed by the fact that she entered late, and through that she had to do everything she could to gain back social capital. And by the time she ends up going home, she does have Rochelle and Sabrina fully on her side, and she also could have had Arlie. So again, that's a pretty decent recovery, even though she wastes that opportunity by the end of it. But again, considering the bad situation she was put in when she came in, I do have her here at number 58. At number 57, another player from BB Can 2. Again, this being one of the earlier boots left on the board, and here we do have Sarah Miller. And I always felt like Sarah was a very solid player. I mean, early on in the game, she was a person expertly playing the middle, being part of the first 5, but also being part of the women's alliance, and then also having good relationships outside that. Now, realistically, how unlucky did she get is definitely a question mark, where, like, obviously, I do think the start of her downfall is the first 5 breaking up, which that was perpetuated due to Canada getting an HOH. But again, realistically, could that have happened anyway? But even beyond that, again, I still feel like Sarah was actually still solidly positioned at that point. I think it wasn't until the fact that Arlie decides to fully flip, and the fact that she was on the block against Allison instead of another member of the first 5, that really just causes her downfall there. Or had she been on the block against Sabrina or a Kenny, I feel like they are more likely to vote out that other person in that situation. However, with Sarah, I think she was more so taken out as a conduit for being in the first 5 than actually because they wanted Sarah specifically out, especially for someone like an Arlie there. And I feel like Sarah, for the most part, actually played pretty well, but does end up having some minor missteps towards the end, and in not keeping her alliance together, that does leave here at 57. Now, number 56, a player that I've always been kind of high on, even though, again, it's talked about how dumb of a move this guy made. But beyond that, I do think he overall played pretty well, and that person is Jordan Parhar from BB Can 3. And again, like, obviously his downfall is really bad. He volunteers as a pawn, and when the nominations end up staying the same, he ends up being voted out in a very close vote. However, again, there's a lot of context mixed out on all this. First up, he nominated to be on the block to not stay on the block. The plan was to use the veto on him to backdoor Bruno. However, that plan gets stopped once Cindy returns to the game, due to Cindy adding an extra number, and through that them thinking it's too early to take out Bruno, which all of this is very unlucky from Jordan's point of view. He essentially gets twist screwed, both in the situation of him not being taken off the block because Cindy returns, but also in the fact that Cindy leads the charge in voting him out. And before that, he was solidly positioned. Again, he had the final 2 with Zach, he had a final 2 with Kevin, he was part of numerous alliances and should have been able to have a solid run in the game, but again, gets very unlucky of how, like, all the little pieces of the last week play out, to where for me, I do land him here at number 56. Number 55, moving on from a batch of players that were very unlucky to a player that was extremely lucky, and that person is Brittany from BB Can 3, who, again, is a player that was just handed power after power after power. Again, one of the luckiest players in the history of BB Can, where, again, like, she was on the bottom for a lot of the season. She was the perpetual pawn for a lot of the season. Yeah, it gets extremely fortunate in multiple scenarios. I mean, she ends up winning an HOH that ends up being the triple eviction, which ends up being a fantastic spot for her. But even then, like, she takes out Willow through it, which is, like, not great. She ends up being on the block ready to go home at the final 7 until Canada essentially just hands her a coup d'etat to where they're able to take out Bruno. She gets very fortunate with certain other comp wins, and it's really just an extremely luck-based game, but it is one that, again, she gets to the final 4 with some serious win equity. Now, really, like, I don't even know for sure that she wins if she gets to the end. Again, I feel like they would have voted Sarah over Brittany, though she probably beats Godfrey, and then, like, the Ashley one's very weird. So again, like, it's not even like a guarantee there, but again, like, I do think as a whole she did play pretty well from the bottom, though she does get extremely lucky circumstances that allow her to break out of that position and does mishandle that position at points, but at the end of the day, again, it's enough for her to be here at 55. Now, number 54, we're moving on to a player from the most recent season of Big Brother Canada. We're moving on to Summer from BB Can 10, who, again, I was someone that was pretty low comparatively this summer to most of the fan base. I feel like Summer was very respected by the fan base, and, like, I still stand by most of that opinion. I do think she is a player that had some pretty good social work early on in the game. I do think she built some pretty solid relationships and was well positioned early on in the game, probably the best positioned after the Kyle HOH, though I do think she squanders that positioning by the end of it, where, again, we see the likes of Kevin and Helena form this opposing alliance and pit the two sides against each other. And through that, we do see Summer playing extremely passively to where she's eventually taken out, not recognizing that Josh wasn't loyal to her. And again, I think all that is pretty bad. However, I do think her impressive social work early on, and also her amount of win equity by the end of the game, is enough to land her at 54. Now, number 53, we're moving on to a player that I will be honest, I didn't know really what to do with him, considering he did spend a lot of the game on the bottom, and even when he was not on the bottom, he wasn't really that active within the majority alliance. But at 53, we do have Adele from BB Can 2, who again starts off the game on the bottom, and through being on the bottom, he does do some good work there. He does build some really good relationships with the likes of Aika, and gets Aika to keep him safe during her HOH week, and does eventually build strong bonds with the likes of Heather and John and Netta to where they form the sloppy seconds, and they flip the game on the first 5. Arlie ends up flipping over to their side, and again, that is probably the high point of Adele's game. Then he almost goes home during Arlie's boot week to where he is on the block against Arlie, though to be fair, that was a very unlucky circumstance of how he got nominated considering how many people were safe. But really, he just ends up being at the bottom of the sloppy seconds from that point forward, not really recognizing that John is willing to let him go and that Netta and Heather are closer to each other than they are to him. And it's really a middling performance after that, especially when like he's HOH and targets Sabrina and Rochelle, which seems like a waste as well. And it's like, again, like it's a middling game by the end of it, but there are some impressive elements early on, and he is able to go from a really bad position to a pretty solid one, only for him to squander that, but still, that's enough for him to be here 53. Now, number 52, we're moving on to another player from the most recent season, but at BB Can 10, we do have Betty, the third placer, and Betty is a player that I think probably gets better over time. I think hearing more about her jury prospects and the fact that, again, like her against Kevin would have been a toss-up and she for sure beats Josh, and the fact that like the jury seemed to really like Betty, I think that definitely increases her spot on the list here. And also the fact that, again, she's a pretty active player throughout a lot of it. Again, she's not super effective all the time, but it's not like she's not doing anything. Like, she is playing the game decently hard. Obviously, she has the fatal flaws of being a bit too loyal, not recognizing that Josh isn't fully loyal to her, and like she has these issues, obviously. But I do think she does some solid work across the season, particularly in like keeping her and Josh off the block when Gino wins HOH, and figuring out Kevin at the final 5 and getting Josh to flip against him. And like, again, there are some good things here and there, but overall not enough to put her too high, considering, again, she was largely ineffective for a lot of the game for me, and because of that, she's here at 52. At number 51, we're moving on to a player that, again, I was also a bit confused on where exactly to land this person, but again, considering where they started and where they ended up, at number 51, I do have Heather from BB Can 2. And Heather is a person that was pretty unfairly treated early on. I mean, she definitely gets ostracized by the women for seemingly no reason, and through that ends up being on the bottom where the women want to target her. Though despite wanting to target her, she does end up staying. Though, to be fair, a lot of that was more so because of Paul playing actively bad, more so than her doing anything that well. But she's able to recover from that. She's able to build a decent relationship with both John, Adele, and Netta to where they form the sloppy seconds, and they're able to flip the game on the first 5 and really take control of the game really up until the very end, where Heather gets all the way to the final 4, to where at that point John needed to win out. And if John did not win out, Heather would have been at the final 3 in a position where she was one comp away from having a very easy win scenario against Sabrina. Now, does she take it? I don't know. I do think she probably would have taken Netta. And also, even at the final 4, it's like she put herself in a position where if John had won the veto, she was pretty much instantly going home. So again, like, that stuff's not great in terms of like the micro positioning of her end game. But I do think for the most part, again, like considering where she started, I think it was definitely a massive improvement. And I feel like Heather's someone that if she were to play again, I feel like she should do pretty well. And for me, that's enough to land her here at number 51. Now, number 50, moving on to a player that really would have not be this high if it wasn't for the fact that her win equity was really large by the end. But at number 50, we do have JC Lynn from BB Can 10, who, again, like, did she play most of the game well? Not really. Again, like, she was a pretty passive player early on. I mean, there is a point where, like, after she gets nominated week 2, she does play pretty well, only for all that to be undone by the Kyle HOH week anyway. But then after that, she just latches on to Gino, and they end up being looked at as a duo. Though, I mean, there's two things about JC Lynn that keep her this high. One, again, is her win equity. By the time of the final 5, she supposedly beats everybody. So that's something impressive to point out. Also, she seemed to be pretty good at competitions. I mean, if she made it through that final 5 round, I would assume she would win out based on her skill sets and the type of competitions that we get. Where really Josh would be our only competition, she was on the block against Josh. Now, I will say the fact that Kevin and Helena vote out JC over Josh there is a bit of a misstep, where again, by that point, they should have voted out Josh, considering how anti-Kevin Helena he was at that point in the game, even though it works out for Kevin. But yeah, I do think that was a misstep there, in JC not getting them to do what's in their best interest. But really, I mean, reason why she is this high is also, like, I feel like JC Lynn would do really well on a return. I think she's a player that has all the skill sets to do really well. It's just that she didn't really put everything together over the course of BB Can 10. But I think if she were able to play again, I feel like she could be a very strong player. That's what leaves her as high as she is here at number 50. Now number 49, and here we do have 2 runners-up back to back. But first, we're starting it off with Braden from BB Can 9. And Braden is a player that I've always been very conflicted on, where I feel like Braden is a player that I could see doing very well in a return. I do think he is such a likable social guy that I feel like he would just naturally fit into most Big Brother casts. However, he's just such a passive player. I mean, BB Can 9, again, like, he really squandered so many opportunities across that game. Though, funnily, despite that, he was very close to winning, where, according to the jury, whoever won that final HOH was essentially going to win the game between him and Ty, which is ridiculous that that's how they decided the final vote, but I think shows you just how willing they still were to vote for Braden, despite all of his passivity. So again, like, I feel like Braden could do very well on a return, despite, again, like, I don't think he did that well on his actual season, despite being close to a win. So yeah, I was largely conflicted on where exactly to land him, but again, for me, I did land him here at 49. Number 48, another runner-up, and this one also a bit of a mixed bag, but here we do have Kelsey from BB Can 4, who has some good and some bad elements to her game. I mean, the good is the fact that she essentially becomes the leader of her alliance. Again, her, Jared, and Raul, she was essentially the center of that and also the most strategic of the 3. So I think that's something to be applauded. She also gets to the final 2 from a position where she had been voted out and came back into the game, which obviously the voting out and coming back to the game part of it is a massive negative. But the fact that she was able to find a path to final 2 with the Pax Pros being a bigger target than her the entire time is impressive. Though at the same time, they needed to win out. Though I will also say that Kelsey's actually probably one of the best mental cop competitors at that point in Big Brother Canada history, where she was well known for how much studying she had done. And again, I think it's a very rocky road here. It's one that, like, she is strategically active across the game. She is good enough at comps. She found a path to the end despite not being in the majority. And really, I think if she were to play again, I think it's another one. I could see Kelsey doing very well in a return, but obviously all the downsides are still there of her lack of threat management early on, and then her being dead in a jury vote because of that, and then also her needing to win out at the end. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but for me, I do have her here at 48. Now number 47, we're moving on to a player that I feel like most people look at this person as someone that should be very low. However, I think they're good enough to be here at 47, and that is Dylan from BB Can 5. And Dylan is a player that I actually feel like he has a decent strategic mind for the game. Again, not great, obviously, particularly in the fact that I think he is very one note. I think he sees the basic strategy of a situation, but doesn't see much beyond that. However, I think in a season that had people kind of over strategizing to a degree, I think Dylan comes off as one of the more rational strategic minds by the end of BB Can 5, and ends up being taken out by a completely irrational move by Karen and her not wanting Kevin to win more so than anything. But realistically, Dylan was on the right path. Again, if Dylan had gotten through that final 5 round, he was still planning on taking Karen to the end, which would have been his best path to a win. And even before that, played a pretty flexible game where, despite being on the bottom right away, he wins the veto to save himself week 2, and then is kind of lumped in with the vets, even though him and Emily are being used as a shield. But following that, he's able to maneuver through the game, realigning along the way, building strong relationships with the likes of Dre and Karen. And it's like, I feel like overall, I think people dismiss Dylan more than they should. Again, he's not an all-time great player, obviously, but to me, I feel like he's good enough to be here at 47. Now, number 46, we're moving on to a player that made one really astronomically terrible move. But outside of that, I think he is a pretty competent player, and that is Jed from BB Can 9. And obviously him using the veto on Beth in his boot week is really bad. However, I think before that, he is a pretty solid player. Now, I will also say that I think he is one of the most scattered brain players to ever play BB Can, where he constantly changes minds on things left and right to the point where it was harming their games and how much they were changing their minds. So obviously that's not great, but him and Ty really held a lot of control early on in the game. Despite the fact that they were being targeted by the other side, again, they were essentially the leaders of their one side. And to the point where someone like a Latoya was taken out before them through the likes of Victoria wanting to work with them moving forward. I do think that is something to be commended to a degree. Though again, still a very rocky game, and with his very explosive exit from the game, I do think it more so leaves him as a middling player, but we're still not even in the great players on the list yet. So again, for me, I feel like 46 was pretty apt. Number 45, moving on to a player that is like mostly just fine. He's really boring, but he's a competent player all around, and that is Jared from BB Can 4, and he's fine. He's aligned with Kelsey and Raul. Despite him being the prototypical big brother player, Kelsey ends up being targeted ahead of him, which is pretty impressive on his end. Though obviously he eventually gets taken out over Kelsey by his eventual boot week, but again, that's all the way at the final 7. But like really, again, he is the prototypical big brother player. Again, he is like a more boring version of Emmett, also not as good as Emmett, but he's good at competitions. He's strategic enough, not great, he's fine. He's social enough, again, not great, but he's fine. Again, like he's a very average player, but is the type of player that would do well on any given Big Brother Canada season, and that is why he's here at number 45. Now, number 44, we're moving on to, again, another one of the more early boots left on the board. A pre-jury boot, technically, even though technically his placement was that of what a normal jury member would be. But either way, we have Kenny from BB Can 2. And again, Kenny, to me, is a pretty solid player all around. Again, like he was a central figure within the first 5. He was the second command to Andrew. He let Andrew take control to where he was kind of hiding behind him. The problem is that he loses Andrew pretty early. Mind you, he loses Andrew because of Canada's HOH, which again, who knows what would have happened if that didn't happen. But that starts his downward trajectory in the game. But again, he did hold a lot of control for early rounds of the game, and even then seemed to have a decent strategic mind. He recognized when John was flipping on him and then decided to target John, though obviously never got the opportunity to do so. By the time of his boot, he still had people wanting to keep him. It's like, again, like he played a solid game in my eyes, despite how early he was taken out, and because that he is here at 44. Now, number 43, we're moving on to a player that throughout her season I thought had a lot of potential and did have some impressive moments, but never fully lived up to it, and that is Tina from BB Can 9. And Tina is a player that was so well positioned for a lot of the game. She was expertly able to ride the middle throughout a lot of the early game of BB Can 9. The problem is that I don't feel like she ever takes true advantage of it. I mean, she is part of the initial Sunsetters Alliance and eventually flips on them and votes out Latoya, and then ends up trying to stick with Kyle more, though obviously Kyle ends up not having the numbers by the end of it to stay. And then that side of the house starts to continuously lose numbers, severely diminishing Tina's position in the game. Again, she is playing a game that's riding the middle, and through the opposite side not having as many numbers, it really makes that position less integral. But even despite that, it's like there are glimmers of good gameplay here and there. There are glimmers of her being able to convince people to do the things that she wants to do. The problem is that she's such a passive player most of the time that it doesn't really matter, as it feels like she's not playing at full throttle at points that she needs to. And eventually she's obviously taken out in a very weird situation where Kiefer is backdoored and she should be safe. I mean, coming into that round, she was probably one of the safest people on the board, as it felt like there was no way for her to actually go home despite the fact that she was on the block. But somehow, again, Jed and Ty and Beth decided to switch up the vote and keep Kiefer around for some reason. Like, mostly because they just feel bad, and that leads to Tina going home. So again, it's a very unlucky circumstance that leads to her eventual boot, but I do think there are elements of impressive gameplay along the way and some solid positioning and a very unlucky end to her game. So again, that's enough for me to put her at 43. Now, number 42, we're moving on to a duo that we're going to be talking about back to back. We're starting it off with the messier of the duo, and from BB Can 6, we do have Allie. And Allie was a pretty active player across the season, one that was pretty integral to how the game played out, and that is largely why she is this high on the list. Mind you, I do think the show really glorified a lot of her gameplay and made it look a lot better than what it was. But yeah, I think she was playing pretty solidly for the early portion of the game, especially coming from a situation where she was on the block week 1. But afterwards, and she fails to get Ryan out in the week that she wants to get him out when he's on the block against Marin. She does eventually vote out Ryan when he's on the block against Johnny, in a situation where Johnny runs circles around really everybody. And despite Ali and Olivia probably being the most loyal to Johnny in this situation, he still decides to use Ali as a pawn instead of the likes of Paris or Maddie the following week because of how much Ali had talked about wanting to take a shot at the other side, to where Johnny obviously didn't want that to go through, and this eventually leads up to her eventual boot. And really, a lot of her boot is straight up just on her. Again, she is one of the worst campaigners I have ever seen in Big Brother, where she just makes it so clear to Paris that she's just unwilling to work for her, despite the fact that Paris is, again, essentially the swing vote in this position. And even beyond that, I think Ali was looked at as a big threat even before that, to where, like, I don't really expect Ali to have a deep run beyond this anyway. So again, like, it's a very middling game, a very messy game, but it was a pretty integral game to how the season played out. So because of that, she's here at 42. At number 41, again, her partner in crime, we do have Olivia. And Olivia, for me, played obviously a very similar game to Ali, but has a couple differences. One, she's less active in the game, which, considering Ali was actively bad, it's more so positive here. But then also, I think Ali did a lot of good work in terms of building a relationship with Johnny, which led to Johnny being a lot more loyal to her than he was to Ali. But I still feel like Olivia had her head on straight, to where she would have gone to the end of Ali had she gotten the opportunity, which, I mean, to be fair, she probably loses against both Ali and Johnny, but at least she has a better shot against Ali. Like, I feel like she's a competent player. Again, like, very similar to Ali, just without the massive downsides that Ali has in terms of her messier gameplay and then also her terrible campaigning. So again, for me, it's enough to put Olivia one spot above her at 41. At number 40, we have a player that, I'll be honest, I actually thought was going to be higher, because I feel like when I look back on this person, I do look at him as a pretty solid player, but he does end up being this low, largely because, like, at the end of the day, he is still a pretty passive player, and that is William from BB Can 5. And William, again, one gets screwed over by the triple. I mean, that's something to mention here, where that was another reason why I considered putting him higher. But really, it's like William was a mostly passive player. I mean, he was a player that really was following along with whatever Dre wanted for a lot of the game, and even then was like losing trust with Dre at points because he would have such strong bond with Kevin. But then his strong bond with Kevin was also a positive for him at points as well, and did allow him to be somewhat better positioned than Dre towards the end. And again, I feel like William did a pretty good job at threat management as well, where despite him winning competitions and having powers, he was never really directly targeted. Again, even in his boot round, he was a secondary target, but was taken out because it was a triple eviction. And like overall, like, again, I think William is a solid player, but I feel like we're at the point of the list where most of the people moving forward are either more active players or players that were a bit more prominent in a certain aspect of the game, to where William really comes off as a mostly solid player on every front without really extending into being that great at any particular thing. And because that, William is left here at number 40. At number 39, we're on to another duo that I did end up having back-to-back here. I know there is a lot of talk about this duo not being as good as what they think, which I agree with that, but I still feel like 39 feels apt for the Shield. And at 39, we're starting it off with Alec. And for me, Alec is, like, on paper the better player. Like, I think Alec is the one that on paper feels like the triple threat. He feels like the most physical of the two, the most social of the two, and then strategically, he's probably on par. But I think through that, he does come off as more of a threat, and I think his threat management was lacking, to where I do think in pretty much every opportunity, Alec would have been the first boot over Peter. And also, we obviously have Alec's eventual boot round where he essentially gives up the veto for Peter, which is a bit of a misstep as well. But again, I do think the Shield gets poo-pooed on for how bad they played after the instant eviction, which again, I do agree with that. But I do feel like they did a decent work early on. They did have a decent amount of control. They had a decent position in the game. They just obviously ruined it all by being too loyal to Emmett, and obviously are really bitter on the way out. But again, that's not really a factor on this list. Again, like, at the end of the day, I do think they had a decent amount of control, but I do think Alec's threat management was lacking, which is why he's below the next person, and here at number 39. At 38, obviously, Ray mentioned it, we have Peter. Now, I know Peter gets talked about as a pretty bad player due to him not using the veto on Topaz, which again is a misstep. However, again, like, it falls back to their original issue to begin with. Their original issue is just trusting Emmett too much. And while again, it was a bad move to not use the veto on Topaz, it really doesn't do that much to really diminish my opinion on his ability as a player. Like, because it's really, at the end of the day, the same flaw. But I think Peter, again, like, had better threat management. He was not looked at as a threat over Alec, while also probably actually being the better player. Like, I think socially he's a bit understated, where like I think he's actually one of the better social players on the season. Strategically, they're on par, and physically, again, they're fine. And also just makes it further as well. So again, because of that, for me, he's here at number 38. Now, number 37, we're moving on to, I believe at this point, one of the earlier boots on the board. But at number 37, we do have, from BB Can 10, we have Herman. And Herman, to me, is another one of these, like, prototypical big brother players. I think he is someone that, coming into any given season, he is destined to do well. He is destined to fall into the majority alliance, be good at comps, be strategic, be social. And he is the type of player that tries to mold his game after the Derek prototype. This getting the strong competitors together and steamrolling the game and build an onion alliance within that. And Herman is exactly that player. Obviously, BB Can 10, though, is an outlier, and it being a season that didn't allow for that style of gameplay. But I do think on most given seasons, Herman's style of gameplay is very effective. And I do feel like this placement on the list here is not really based around his actual game in BB Can 10, which was solid for his placement, but it's more so indicative of how I feel like he would do in the grand scheme of Big Brother, where I do feel like on most appearances he would do very well, and that's why he's here at number 37. Now, number 36, where I believe this is the last pre-jury boot on the board, with the obvious exception of BB Can 8 people. But here we do have Erica from BB Can 6. And again, Erica has one massive issue in her game, and that is threat management. Her threat management is abysmal. Again, she continuously won comps. She made it clear that she was a strategic player as well. Like, she really was a triple threat. The problem is that everyone knew it, and that was a massive issue for Erica. But despite that, she was still able to really solidly build allies, had a very strong relationship with Johnny, also had a good relationship with Will by the end of it, where both of them wanted her to stay. Also, Ryan tried to keep her as well. Like, it's not like she was dead in the water even by the time she was put on the block, but even then, she gets twist screwed, where this is a situation where Canada saves Ryan because they hated Kayla, only to give Kayla her best case scenario of allowing her to get rid of Erica, who was the fan favorite. So again, it's all a ridiculous situation also. So again, like, I think at the end of the day, Erica gets massively screwed, and while like her downfall is probably coming soon anyway due to her lack of threat management, the way she does go out is definitely unlucky, and because of that, she's here at 36. Now, number 35, we're moving on to a player that also has a very fatal flaw, and his fatal flaw is the fact that he's too blindly loyal. But outside of that, a pretty strong player, and that is Andrew from BB Can 1. And Andrew is a person that, again, like, I think is pretty much a well-rounded player. I think he's good at competitions. He's good socially to where most people liked him, and he's good enough strategically. Again, like, I think he's missing the killer instinct, which is the big thing. But outside of that, like, when on the bottom, like, he knew who to align with, how to maneuver through the game. And like, overall, again, like, he is a solid player. He is a pretty competent player all around that does also get screwed a bit by Gary coming back in the game. Though realistically, again, like, was he going to be the target at Final Four initially anyway? Yeah. But obviously Gary ends up winning the veto, and that becomes a wonky situation in itself. So it's like, again, like, I mean, he's minorly twist screwed and still had potential to win, where I do think he beats Jillian and was a competent all-around player. So for me, that's enough to land him here at number 35. Now, number 34, moving on to another player that had decent win equity by the end and was also a solid competitor, and that is Derek from BB Can 6. And Derek is someone that, from what I understand, for sure beats Kayla. It's close between him and Paris, and then realistically probably beats everyone else in the final five. Like, he is technically pretty close to a win, despite not really knowing what he's doing for a lot of the game. Again, he is another one of these, like, prototypical Big Brother players that gets lumped into the majority alliance right away. While he kind of lost control, largely due to Hamza being Hamza, him and Kayla are essentially able to comp out from pretty far back. And it is his relationship with Kayla that gets him through the end game stretch when he starts to lose some competitions. Though obviously at the final three, he still needed to win that final competition to win the game. But he was extremely close to winning the game. Feels like a well-rounded player where he's good physically, good socially. Again, strategically, he's fine enough. So again, like, for me, that's enough to land him here at 34. Now, number 33, we're finally getting around to the other Pax bro. We're at Nick. And Nick is a very interesting case here, because when you're thinking of, like, the Pax Bros win, I feel like Nick is really who you should be thinking of. Again, like, as I said with Phil, like, Phil did not contribute that much good to the duo there, where Nick was the comp beast for the duo. He won the majority of the comps that they had won, while also was a much more palatable person in the house, was a much more under the radar player to where he wasn't going out and blowing up their spot through some really dumb conversations. Like, again, Nick is overall like a very fine Big Brother player that was paired up with a pretty bad Big Brother player. Now, at the end of the day, again, is Nick that good? No, not really. But again, I think he's in line with the likes of a Derek and an Andrew that we just talked about. So again, that's enough for him to be here at 33. Now, number 32, we're moving on to one of the last BB Can 8 players on the board. And here we do have Brooke. And like the other BB Can 8 people, obviously tough to assess considering we don't see how the season plays out. But based on where the season was when it was ending, Sheldon and Brooke were running the game. Despite Sheldon having just won 2 HOHs in a row and people talk about how he's mismanaging his threat level, it never seemed to catch up to them at this point, with them having essentially the entire game on lock with multiple alliances and multiple paths to the end. And while again, at the end of the day, I do credit Sheldon for a lot of that, Brooke was there alongside him and was also a competent player in her own right. Now again, like, we don't know exactly how the game would have played out. We don't know if Brooke would even had the respect by the end to win the game but again, I feel like the things that Sheldon gets credit for, I feel like a lot of it you can also give some credit to Brooke. And at the end of the day, I do think of her as like somewhat similar to the next couple people we'll be talking about in terms of game ability. So really, at the end of the day, I did end up landing here at 32. At number 31, we're moving on to a player that I remember being super high on over the course of BB Can 5, but then her game really unraveled super quickly, but I feel like there are definitely good aspects of her game, and that person is Dre. And again, Dre is an interesting player here to where right off the bat, she's left out of the majority alliance, but has a really good relationship with Ica that does very well for her as Ica eventually flips against that majority alliance. And through doing so, we obviously see this battle between Bruno and Kevin and Ica and Dimitris, and Dre is in a perfect position sitting in the middle, and she's actively doing so. We see her going to a lot of the newbies and essentially gathering the troops to allow them to play the middle and solidifying her position within that to where it felt like she was the number one position player in the game. The problem is that she gets exposed in that she kind of leaks too much to Dylan and Karen, where they go back and tell Ica and Dimitri, and then really her game blows up from there. But again, there was a point where she was really well positioned in the game and seemed on track to really just steamroll the rest of the game. So again, for me, that is impressive, and because that, she's here at number 31. Now, number 30, we're moving on to another player from the most recent season of the show. From BB Can 10, we do have Helena. And Helena is a tough player to assess, largely because of her lack of win equity. Helena is a player that had no respect from the jury, and I don't think there's a single scenario where she can win. And obviously, that's a massive issue. However, outside of that, she was working alongside Kevin in most of the things that they were doing. Now, I will say again, like, I give Kevin most of the credit for most things, where even most points where Helena does things on her own, it's usually things that are perpetuated by things that Kevin told her to do. And while she is effective in doing the things that Kevin told her to do, I do think at the end of the day, again, like, Kevin was the main strategist for the duo. And I think mixing that in for lack of win equity, again, it makes it tough to really assess her. But again, like, at the end of the day, like, most of the moves that Kevin did, Helena did as well. And for that, it's enough to land her at number 30. Now, number 29, we're moving on to first two-time player in a while, I feel like. But here we're moving on to Cassandra from BB Can 4 and 5, which this might be a bit low for some people. I'm a bit unsure on where exactly Cassandra's looked at nowadays, but I do feel like at the end of the day, this is kind of apt. I mean, Cassandra is a player that her first time around, I do think she gets extremely lucky throughout the game. I mean, there are parts where she is playing pretty well, particularly towards the end game stretch, but again, early on, she's an extremely messy player, where while she is like playing in the middle and does have strong ties to Kelsey and Jared, like, she's still like messily playing both sides to the point where she gets caught by Levita and becomes a target for week 3, only to be saved by the middle alliance. She then sides with Tim and ends up alongside him, failing to save Dallas, and really gets saved by the fact that Mitch gets screwed. But following that, again, I do think she plays pretty well. The problem is that she couldn't win a competition to save her life, where despite her getting rid of Jared at a decent spot in the game, and then using the Vita, tricking the Pax Bros into leaving her off the block to where she saves Tim, which is all pretty good gameplay there. The problem is that they just couldn't win a competition from the final 5 on, which really ends up screwing her, and really Tim outplays her at that point in making her set up for 4th place instead of 3rd. So, but again, like it's a very rocky game with pros and cons, and then really her BB Can 5 game is just all cons. It's all bad. Like while she did seem to be in Dimitri's ear early on, she does lose control over him eventually, and obviously ends up being the third boot. Again, like it's not a good game in BB Can 5, but again, like I do think there are impressive elements of her game in BB Can 4, to where despite it being extremely messy, and to be fair, her BB Can 5 game does drop her a bit here, it is still good enough for her to be at number 29. Now, number 28, we're moving on to a player that I believe at this point is one of the earlier boots left on the board, being a first juror. But here we do have Arlie from BB Can 2, and Arlie is a mixed bag of a player, like Cassandra for me, where there are definitely points in this game where it is very impressive. Again, he plays the middle pretty well for a lot of it, being in the middle of the first 5 and then also the sloppy seconds, though he does eventually side with the sloppy seconds in a spot where I don't know if it was his best move, especially when he's getting rid of Sarah, who is someone he was extremely close to. And then obviously we have his eventual downfall, which is just really bad in the sense that he should have stayed. Like the fact that he gets completely outplayed by John Netta in that round is pretty bad overall. But I do think he demonstrated a lot of game ability through him trying to play the middle. He also seemed to be competent in competitions, and all around, like just a solid player, despite some missteps towards the end. So he's here at number 28. Now, number 27, we have a player that I think gets remembered for his really dumb move, but I do think overall is actually a really strong player of BB Can, and that is Zach from BB Can 3. And again, like there's a really bad move in all this. Obviously, him putting up JP, leaving JP on the block, really terrible. But again, obviously that is perpetuated by a twist of Cindy coming back, and also even outside that, still plays a pretty solid game. Again, he's essentially the leader of the Diaper Alliance, which obviously through that comes some lack of threat management. But again, like it's Zach, this really tall, athletic guy. It's like obviously he's not going to be able to hide it. Though to be fair, also that lack of threat management actually saves him in the triple, where that's why Bruno saves him. But he did have a decent strategic sense in the game. He was pretty social. Again, very well-rounded player. And then mixing that in with the fact that he ends up getting all the way to the final 6 with massive win equity. Again, like for me, it's good enough to land him here at 27, despite some obvious missteps in threat management. Now, number 26, we're moving on to his showmance from BB Can 3. We do have Ashley, and Ashley is a very solid player. Like she's someone that does play under the radar for a lot of the game, but she really pops when she needs to. It's again, when her alliance starts to crumble, the Diaper Alliance, she actually starts to win a good chunk of comps and gets all the way to the final 3 in a position where she had some serious win equity. I think the problem is that she was going to take Godfrey to where she would have lost, to where she would have won against Sarah, but still, everyone was making a bad decision pretty much at that point in the game. So I think she does do decent threat management. She was willing to cut Zach the entire time. She was always planning on taking Peely to the end until her boot, and those are all pretty optimal paths in the game. She does get extremely lucky at the triple, where she comes very close to being backdoored there, and if it wasn't for Brittany's really strange move in putting up Willow, she would have probably gone home in that position. But again, overall, I think a solid player here at number 26. Now, number 25, we have a player that I think is kind of forgotten about at this point, a player that played pretty well up until their eventual disastrous boot week, but at 25, we do have Joel from BB Can 4, and Joel is actually a pretty good player. It's like for most of the season, he expertly played the middle, being alongside Mitch for a lot of what Mitch was doing. And while there were points where like he didn't necessarily get his way, where obviously he wanted to keep Levita in for longer and Dallas, it's like he didn't really get his way all the time, but he was never targeted. He was well positioned the entire time. And even coming into the end game, he gets saved over Nikki on the block because of how much the Pax Bros and Kelsey thought they had him on his side. Again, that's really impressive. The problem is that obviously he blows up his game in the final week, but that doesn't negate like his strong gameplay up to that point. And especially when like the reason he blows up his game is because like, again, his side just simply couldn't win the competitions they needed to. So again, for me, I think Joel's a solid player. He's here at number 25. Now, number 24, we're moving on to a player who I feel like played similarly to Joel, but they'd come a step closer to winning the game, and that person is Kiefer. And Kiefer's another person that, again, played the middle for a lot of the game. Mind you, I will say that it seemed like he was more blindly loyal to the Jet and Ty side for a good chunk of it, but eventually he branches off, and through his relationships with Tina and Tara, and then also Victoria, he's able to position himself pretty well afterwards. Though obviously Victoria ends up going home, and then he ends up being backdoored, but he's able to convince Ty and Jed to save him there mostly because they just felt bad, which was ridiculous. And for us to follow that up with Kiefer being the main orchestrator of the Jed blindside, which I think he's probably the person you give the most credit to, both in the fact that I think it probably benefits him the most, and also the fact that he was the most integral to actually making it happen. Again, that is a pretty good move, especially when being surrounded by a whole bunch of other people that weren't playing the round that well. Again, he still has missteps across that week, but like not as bad as everyone else who was also playing terribly. But again, he holds control through to final fives and really gets taken out at the final four due to him being the biggest jury threat on the board. Again, lack of threat management. And also, I will say, like, a bit of a knock in the fact that he can't get Tara to take him to the end in a position where it did seem beneficial for Tara to do so, considering at that point it increases her chances of one, getting to part 3, but also of being taken to the end potentially. But again, like, it's a mixed bag of a game for Kiefer. But again, him surviving the back door and then executing the Jed plan and also being decently positioned through the mid game, again, that's enough for him to land here at number 24. Now, number 23, we're moving on to another of our two-time players here. And from BB-Can 1 and 5, we do have Gary. And Gary is obviously a very interesting player in the sense that obviously he was voted out at the final 8 of BB-Can 1 and then came back at the final 5 and was able to get to the end of the game and essentially won. I mean, if it wasn't for Topaz, he would have won the game. But obviously, he was in a position where he was greatly favored to win that jury vote through the fact that he spent time with the jury. But I do think that's a game where, like, Gary started to pick up the game more as time went on. Again, he had a very messy beginning, but built a strong relationship with Tom, only to then backstab him, and then built a good relationship with the Shield, only for them to backstab him. But then he comes back into the game and then does build a good, strong bond with Emmett, to where Emmett believes that he's going to take him to 2, which leads to Emmett taking him to final 3, to where he eventually cuts Emmett. Mind you, part of that is due to Dan Giesling being in the house for a bit to convince him, but still. And then we see him come back for BB-Can 5 and has a very middling run, though I do feel like a lot of that is affected by pregame, especially with his relationship with Netta being on shaky terms. But again, like, I think overall Gary is a solid player. I think he's one that if he were to play again, I would actually have a decent amount of faith in Gary. I feel like he's a person that learns the game more and more the more he plays, and should become a better player the more and more he plays if he's not affected by pregame stuff. So yeah, overall, I feel pretty decent about Gary, but again, like, obviously there's still massive holes to where he's here at number 23. Now, number 22, we have another runner-up here, and here we do have the runner-up of BB-Can 6, we have Kayla. And Kayla's always been a very divisive player. Like, obviously she is one that on paper people seem to think played a very strong game. However, again, I've obviously had massive issues with her game. I mean, I think one, jury management was severely lacking. But even beyond that, she was in a position where she had to win out alongside Derek, where they continuously had to win competitions back to back in order to keep themselves in the game. She was also in a position where she failed to get rid of her targets at points. She wanted Ryan out at the Marin vote and was unsuccessful. She wanted Johnny out initially, but gets tricked into keeping him. She obviously gets Erica out, but that's a position where she was greatly benefited by a twist. Though I will say again, like, I do think you have to give her a lot of credit for the final 8 round, though also Allie's mistake definitely factor into that as well. But again, like, overall, again, like, I think Kayla is a solid all-around player. She's strategic, social enough, though I do think that's definitely her major downside in her game, but also, like, good at competitions. Like, really, I do think it was her lack of jury management that really ruined her game by the end of it. But again, solid game outside that, and she's here at number 22. Now, number 21, we're moving on to the first winner of the show, and we have Jillian from BB-Can 1, who is obviously a very weird player to talk about when it comes to, like, something like a winner ranking, due to the fact that she won despite the fact that she wasn't supposed to win. But on a player ranking here, again, like, she's still a pretty solid player. Again, very good at competitions, one of the best competitors in the history of the show. Socially, she's fine. I mean, she's not, like, great, but she did have several really important relationships that helped her navigate through the game, and did get to the end with a lot of those relationships as well, where Tala and Andrew were people that were closer to her than to Emmett. I do think strategy-wise, though, she's pretty bad, and also when it comes to jury management as well, like, really abhorrent jury management with a lot of the jury members. But even beyond that, strategically, I do feel like Emmett did a lot of the legwork in that front, but still a solid player. Though one that, for the sake of this ranking, I'm essentially looking at her as a runner-up, considering it's like she should not have won that season. Or if this was Survivor and you had to write down the name of the person that was going to win, she would have lost the game there. It's really by the voting method that she ends up winning. So again, wonky win, but solid player all around. She's here at number 21. Now number 20, moving on to another two-time player. And here we do have Bruno from BB Can 3 and 5, who I am conflicted on as a player. I will say, like, over the course of BB Can 3, I did feel like he was one of the better players there. I do think he was massively screwed over by Brittany essentially being handed a coup d'etat. And while obviously you can say that, yeah, he did mismanage his relationships with Brittany and Sarah, I mean, that wasn't looked at as a possibility that would come back to bite him in that situation. But again, plays a very impressive game, being essentially the leader of the chop shop while having Greg as a shield for him, and then following that up with flipping the game on JP, which, mind you, I do think he gets saved by Cindy coming back to where he would have been the backdoor target there anyway, but still executes the JP move, and then also is able to not get much of the blame for it. In the triple, we have this really great move of saving Zach, really showing him manage his threat level really well. And then obviously he just gets screwed by a twist. And yeah, a lot of that due to his temper and him burning his relationships with Sarah and Brittany. And then BB Can 5, we see a pretty similar game, just not with twist involved, where he plays a similar game of letting Netta take control while him and Kevin sit from behind. And again, fails in getting Cindy to not take out Netta. That's a bit of a misstep. But from that point on, it's really just competitions. But even then, he gets unlucky when he goes home, in the sense that Kevin gets saved by William. Though again, you can credit Kevin for building the relationship with William to begin with, but through that pretty much automatically sends Bruno home there. But again, overall, I think Bruno's a solid player. Again, knowing more about Bruno after the fact, in terms of seeing how he plays other games, I feel like he may be a very chaotic figure in most situations, but across his two BB Can games, I think he's played pretty well both times. I think he just misses out a bit socially from the fact that I don't think he can wrap his head around other people that aren't thinking logically, but overall still a solid player. He's here at number 20. Now number 19, moving on to a player that I think is a very solid player that makes a really bad move at the end. And here at number 19, we do have Josh from BB Can 10. And obviously there's a lot of talk about how bad of a move Josh made by voting out Betty over Kevin, but realistically, he loses against both. Really, his biggest issue is jury management before that, where he ends up backstabbing the likes of Moose and Herman and Summer in positions where they thought he was fully loyal to them, which, again, can be a double-edged sword. Again, because obviously there are points where juries would respect that style of gameplay, but obviously on this season, not so much. But outside of that, he is a very solid player. He's very passive early on, and that's kind of an issue, where he's put into the initial majority alliance, but he's not really talking to a lot of them, instead bonding with the people outside of the alliance, which is technically a pro in that he's building a lot of relationships, but he's also kind of isolating himself from that initial majority alliance, to where that's part of why Kyle is willing to take him out during his HOH week, though obviously the backdoor ends up failing there. But that is when he starts to do some impressive work. His campaigning is really strong across that week, where he does reassure a lot of relationships, wins Marty back to his side. Marty, the guy that got Kyle the backdoor Josh to begin with. And that's all really good gameplay. And then eventually, obviously, he does team up with Kevin, which does allow him to navigate through the game pretty smoothly afterwards, though at the same time, it does also make him make moves that are against his best interest from a jury standpoint. But then we get to the end of the game where he essentially comps out. He wins out at the very end, despite not winning a competition before that, which that is pretty impressive from a player point of view, where again, he essentially shows that he is competent in all three facets of the game at that point. Though obviously, I think the big issue is jury management and also having a misread by the end of the game. But overall, I still think he's a solid enough player that just made some pretty big mistakes. But I would have a lot of faith on him on a return, and that's why he's here at number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a winner that I actually look at very similarly to Josh. And I'm sure there's going to be some people that disagree with this, but at number 18, I do have Ty. And again, I think Ty played a game that has been really glorified as time has gone on. And Ty had a very impressive endgame. He showed that he had the killer instinct and took out Jed, even though at that point, I don't even know if it was the right move to take out Jed, but at least he showed the killer instinct there and was able to hold control and win enough comps to get his way to the end. So his path to that point is very rocky. Again, while Jed and Ty had a lot of control within their group, they also had an opposing side that was directly coming after them, with Ty being the target of that other side for a lot of the game. So like obviously that is an issue. Also, I feel like Ty's jury management is really bad. And it's to the point where like he really should have just outright won against Braden. Like there really shouldn't have been a question. But instead, based on what the jury has said, they voted for Ty because he won final HOH. Not because of anything else he did in the game, but more so they were going to decide who they won by whoever won the final HOH, which is so ridiculous for someone that outright outplayed a good chunk of the jury there in a position where they were looking at the game from a gameplay point of view. So I feel like those are issues for me, but I think Ty is a player that if he were to come back, play another season, I would have a lot of faith in him. Again, he is a very well-rounded player, and because of that, he is here number 18. Now number 17, we're moving on to the top player from Big Brother Canada 8. And here we do have Sheldon. And Sheldon for me is the biggest what if in the history of Big Brother. I do think Sheldon was set up to steamroll the entire season, and we just simply never got to see it. Based on the way that the season ended, Sheldon was perfectly positioned in the game, and despite a lot of adversity that he faced in his close ally in Kyle getting ejected from the game, and him now having to face the quit of Carol in a position where he had array targeted the likes of Rianne and Min Lee and all these things, he was still perfectly positioned in the game. No one was coming after him, despite how big of a comp threat he seemed to be. Most players wanted to take him far into the game, which is just ridiculous. It is insane how well positioned he was at the end of BBCan 8, which makes it all that disappointing that we never got to see the season play out. And because of that, I don't know where really to place him. And really for me, again, like I end up putting him above Ty because I do look at him as better than Ty. Like I think of him as a player on a similar caliber to Ty, but without all of the minute issues that I have with Ty's game. And like obviously that's partially because we didn't get to see the rest of Sheldon's game, but based on what we did see, a really impressive game that does leave him at number 17. Now, number 16, we're moving on to a player that I believe was in my top 10 last time I did a top 10 BBCan player video, though my opinion on this person's game has dropped since then. And at number 16, we do have Adam Pike from BBCan 7, who is a player that I do think you have to give him a lot of credit for the creation of the Pretty Boys. This was an alliance that he had formed before the season even started, and to see him put it into action and that be the dominant alliance of the season is very impressive. However, he was always on the bottom of the Pretty Boys, with the fact that Dane and Anthony were aligned for most of it, and really there was never a point where the likes of Anthony was planning on taking Adam to the end. So it's like Adam was never really that well positioned within it, but was obviously really good at comps, was a pretty influential player across the game, even though he was again on the bottom of the Pretty Boys. But again, like really, I feel like this is the best case scenario for Adam, where I feel like this season played out the best that it could, and even then he didn't win. So for me, that's like the struggle of putting him at the very top, considering I do feel like he's missing out a bit on a killer instinct. I think the fact that he never does go after Dane is a bit of a misstep for him, and he did plan on going to Dane, to which, to be fair, he probably would win, though it probably would be a close vote. But still, it's like, to me, Adam does have a lot of holes in his game, but he did also have some pretty impressive aspects of his game, specifically his strategic forethought and his comp ability that do leave him here at number 16. Now, number 15, we're moving on to a player that gets a lot of praise from BBCan 4, and like I loved watching this person on BBCan 4, but I always felt like was overstated as a player. And here at number 15, we do have Tim. And again, Tim is a player that I do think there are impressive aspects to his game, particularly socially. I think he is a very charismatic figure to where people just adore him. The problem is that I feel like he gets propped up a lot as a big strategic player. However, I never found him to be that good strategically. He is a very ego-centric player to where I think he really has an ego about him and really plays up to that, which I do think is a massive issue in his decision-making a lot of the time. Also, comp-wise, he's mostly just fine, but really that's really what causes the end of his game is that fact that he can't win any comps, where he's a guaranteed to win against anyone in the final 5, but simply could not get to the end because he couldn't win a comp to save his life towards the end game. And a lot of that comes down to his lack of care in studying days, to which everyone had told him that that's an important aspect of the game. So again, like I feel like that's a misguided thing. And also, like, I just think he gets extremely lucky with the fact that the fake double eviction occurs, where he had just lost the battle for Nikki's vote with Mitch, only for Kelsey to come back in the game targeting Mitch, and that greatly benefits his game as well. So even beyond that, has some very questionable decisions at points. He pisses off the Pax Bros to where they're then targeting him and they put him on the block. You have him again failing to get rid of Dallas when he wanted to. You have him voting out Cassandra at the Christine vote for like no real reason. And like there's a lot of misguided strategic plays for me from Tim that leave him here at 15. Now number 14, moving on to another player that was in my top 10 last time I did a list. He has been bumped off, not really because my opinion on his game has gone down, but more so my opinion of other games have gone up. And at number 14, we do have Godfrey from BB Can 3. And Godfrey is a very interesting player for BB Can. Obviously, the antithesis to a lot of modern Big Brother players, and the fact that he doesn't win many competitions, and he plays a very under-the-radar game. Not really taking control of the game at really any point, but still plays a pretty impressive game in terms of positioning. Now, I will say that he does get saved partially by the fact that Cindy comes back into the game. He does get saved in the fact that if Cindy did not come back into the game and the veto was not used, he would have gone home over JP. However, at the same time, the veto was going to be used before Cindy came back. So again, it's a bit of a mixed bag. But beyond that, I mean, you also have the fact that he makes the wrong decision at the end, where he has a clear-cut decision of he wins against Ashley, he loses against Sarah. He makes the wrong decision due to a misread of the jury, and that's pretty bad as well. But again, his positioning throughout the game is very impressive. It feels like a very Dr. Will style of game, which is something we rarely see effective in the modern day. And while obviously it would be a lot better if he had the respect from the jury to win, and if he did so, he would be very highly ranked on this list, it is the fact that he loses that makes me have to drop him a bit to where he's here at number 14. Now, number 13, moving on to a player that was also in my top 10 last time, and I bumped him down. At 13, we do have Sarah from BB Can 3. And Sarah's always been a very conflicting player to me, and the reason why she was even in the top 10 last time is because of how I would assume she would do very well in a return. I do think Sarah is a pretty solid Big Brother player. The problem is that BB Can 3 kind of demonstrate all the negative attributes of her game. I do feel like she had poor reads at points. I do feel like she got extremely lucky through twists to where Cindy came back, being told to work with Sarah. She had Brittany win the triple eviction, and even then messed it up by voting out Willow accidentally. She had Brittany getting the coup d'etat that benefited her positioning. Like, she had a lot of things go her way. But again, I think final 3 is still impressive. Her convincing Godfrey to take her to the end. Also, just in general, I feel like she is a player that gathers respect. I feel like she's the type of player that people assume played a good game, even if they didn't. And I think that's pretty much what happened in BB Can 3. Like, I do think she's a player that I think would play better on a return, but it's the fact that we haven't gotten that return that I decided to actually bump her down at this point, just because it's like, again, that's all speculative, while the people moving forward on the list we saw more proof of. So because of that, I leave Sarah here at 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to 2 players back-to-back here that I think are very similar players that both got screwed over by twists and had a lot of control before those twists. And this one was actually another person also in my top 10 last time, though, again, got bumped down, mostly because other people moved up. But at number 12, we do have Johnny from BB Can 6, who, again, I've praised a lot on this channel. I do think Johnny played a very impressive game across BB Can 6, holding a lot of control from the very beginning, really up until the Erica boot, where he was positioned perfectly in the middle, was running things from behind the scenes, got his way pretty much the entire game up until that point. Again, convinced Olivia to put up Hamza, got the votes to take out Marin. He had very impressive maneuvers, but then he has the Erica vote, where I do think that is a massive misstep. The fact that he goes so far out of his way to save Erica and gets upset when Erica goes home, that I think really exposes his game there. But again, we have the really impressive final 9 round, probably one of the most impressive rounds of gameplay by any individual person ever. And the fact that he's able to juggle around so many dynamics there in order to get a unanimous vote to stay over Ryan, despite him being the very clear target from the beginning, where he essentially needs to do this very strange maneuver of getting these 3 different sides to agree to keep him without them recognizing that the other 2 sides have more of his loyalty than their side. So again, he needs to get Allie and Olivia, who are targeting the Paris, Will, and Maddie side, he needs to get them to agree to keep him under the context that he is going to come after Paris, Maddie, and Will. Well, also he is telling them that he has Paris, Maddie, and Will. So again, the way that he's able to trick all these different groups into thinking that he's more loyal with them in order to eventually get a unanimous vote for that vote is insane. It is an insane level of difficulty that he pulls off there. Problem is that it just blows up on him the following week, where he wins HOH. He gets very unlucky with the veto result where Derek wins veto, and at that point, he's forced to put up one of his allies on the block. And with Allie and Olivia and the Paris, Maddie, Will trio coming after each other, it's like there really was no winning in that scenario outside of being able to convince them to stick true to their allegiance to Johnny, which he was not able to do. Which again, that is the thing that keeps him at number 12 here, is the fact that he failed at that part of the game. The fact that he failed to keep Paris in line in keeping Allie in the game. The fact that he failed to keep Erica around as well, though to be fair, that was more twist related. But still, it's like, I feel like there are more things to point out that are negative, and I think like the final 8 round in particular is something directly caused by him that I think is enough to land him outside the top 10 at this point to where he's at number 12. At number 11, very similar player, very similarly twist screwed, very similarly very impressive in the game. At number 11, we do have Mitch from BB Can 4, who again, very impressive game. I mean, like, he won the battle against Tim. Like, he had Tim cornered after getting Nikki to side with him over Tim, which is pretty impressive. But it was all for naught as Kelsey comes back into the game and was told by Levita to target Mitch. And again, like, this is all very wonky, especially when like it's Raul of all people to get rid of Mitch, which I guess that's probably the one downside you can say, is that he wasn't able to convince Raul to keep him when it was against his best interest. But again, it's all perpetuated by a twist that really just messes up his game here. Again, like, he was poised to steamroll the game from that point forward. He had already gained leverage with the Jared and Raul side of things through siding with them and getting rid of Dallas. He had already won the battle against him in pulling over Nikki to his side. He also was the one to initially concept the concept of the mighty middle and navigating between the two sides. And it's like, again, there's so much impressive gameplay from Mitch in the first half of the season, but it all comes crumbling down due to a twist. And the reason why I do have him above Johnny at this point where I didn't before is because I do feel like Johnny did more wrong in the game than Mitch. Though to a fair part of that is because Mitch is the one that directly gets screwed by a twist, while Johnny's more so in a situation where his alliance member gets screwed. But still, I have Mitch above him slightly at number 11 here. Now number 10, and again, we're at the top 10 players of BB Can. Again, if I were to redo this top 10 at this point, this would be my top 10. So let's start off at number 10. Someone that wasn't in my top 10 last time, and actually really the first 3 were people not in my top 10. But at number 10, I do have someone that people wanted in my top 10 last time. We do have Ika Wong from BB Can at 2 and 5. And again, my opinion of Ika has kind of gone up over time. I do have massive issues with her jury management. Again, it is really terrible. However, I do think I give her a lot more credit for how she maneuvers the game at this point. In BB Can 5 in particular. Obviously, BB Can 2, it's tough to really assess considering it's a mostly mediocre run, but I don't think it's really indicative of how she would play in the modern day, where again, she largely just gets outplayed by the likes of Sabrina and getting Rochelle to take Ika out for her, and also failing to keep Paul around. So again, that's pretty bad. But BB Can 5, again, like, I do think she plays a pretty solid game. Again, like, I do think socially, I kind of discredit her as well, to where like I do think she plays well socially. I think a major difference between now and what I did back then is kind of recognize the separation between a social game within the game and the fact of jury management. I do think Ika's social game, for the most part, is very strong. Like, obviously, there are people that she doesn't get along with. That is an issue. Like, her treatment of Jackie, her handling of Netta on her way out, though, to be fair, that's part of jury management. But again, like, there are ups and downs of her social game, but like the fact that she was extremely close to a lot of the newbies, to obviously Dimitri, like, that's pretty good. Like, obviously Karen ends up giving up her game for the likes of Ika and Dimitri, and that's also pretty good. And again, she gets to the final 4 in a position where if Kevin had not won out, she would have been primed to get taken to the final 2. Obviously the issue is, does she win even against Karen, which don't really know, but I do feel like she loses against everyone else, so obviously that's a big issue. But again, I do feel like I definitely credit her control over the game a bit more, especially considering, like, again, like, Dre was someone that was trying to build up a rebellion, but wasn't able to do so, and Ika is able to flip over to likes of Dylan and Karen along the way. And again, like, overall, like, again, the big issue here is jury management. That is Ika's big issue. And also the fact that she can't really save a comp to win her life in BB Can 5. But overall, I do think she is a better player than I accounted for last time, and she's here at number 10. At number 9, another player from BB Can 5, and here we have the winner of the season. We have Kevin Martin. And obviously, Kevin is a 2-time player, having played in Season 3 as well. And Kevin is a very tough player to assess because he broke the game. The way he wins BB Can 5 is in a way that is very abnormal, but it's one that he studied. He made sure to figure out the patterns of the endgame competitions and practice the type of questions they would ask. And he just completely steamrolls the game at the end in a way that is completely unprecedented. It is unprecedented the way that he dominates in competitions at the end, largely due to him figuring out the pattern of how the competitions are usually structured. Now, I will say there is still luck in all that. Obviously, they could change that structure, which they didn't, but again, that would have obviously led to the end of his game. But even beyond that, I do feel like Kevin is still a pretty good player. I do think he's obviously not an elite player outside of his comp ability and the fact that he always somehow ends up on the bottom, where again, he's on the bottom initially in BB Can 3 and is able to recover from that, but is still taken out as a big threat by the end. And then BB Can 5, he's solidly positioned at the beginning, but then obviously loses control when Netta goes home and then Bruno goes home, and he's really left with nobody, but that's when he's able to comp out. And it's he's the type of player that if he's able to reach the end game, just lock him in for the end, in a position where I think he wins a jury vote most times. Kevin is a bit of a unicorn in Big Brother history of someone that has gamed the competitions to the point where I think you have to give him credit for it. And that's a lot of the reason why he is as high on the list here as number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to the final player that was eligible for my previous top 10, that wasn't in the top 10 last time, but is now, and that person is Demetres from BB Can 5. And I feel like Demetres is another player that my opinion of his game has gone up over time. While I do think there's definitely missteps from him, especially from a jury management perspective at points, I think at the end of the day, Demetres is one of the best comp competitors in the history of the show, especially when we're taking out the aspect of Kevin Martin breaking the competitions. I think Demetres is insanely impressive in competitions, to where I think on any given season, I would have so much faith in Demetres to win a good chunk of them. And when we're in the position where Demetres was breaking records with the amount of comps he was winning, when he was on the same season as Kevin, that is kind of insane. And mixing that with the fact that he is a pretty decent social and strategic player as well, I think this amounts to a really impressive Big Brother Canada player. Now, obviously, the big thing is that he's missing out on the win. I do think if he had won, he would be higher on this list. And really, him not winning exemplifies my issues with competitions to begin with. But again, still a very impressive game in BB Can 5, to where again, I do think he beats Karen, he beats Ika. While he does lose to Kevin, they were never going to the end together anyway. He was really so close to the win there that for me, I did end up putting him here at number 8. Now number 7, and straight up, my top 7 is mostly intact, where there is obviously one new player on this list who should be very obvious, but the remaining 6 are the exact same final 6 as my previous list, and in that exact same order, with obviously the inclusion of the new player. So again, you might have seen this order before, but we'll run through it anyway. At number 7, from Big Brother Canada 2, we do have John Party, the winner of the season. And again, John, for me, my opinion has mostly stayed the same. I think he is another one that is a pretty well-rounded player. He does have the killer instinct, as we saw by him cutting Netta. I do think he gets saved a bit from Canada's HOH, where coming into that round, he was going to be the target for the first 5, though obviously they never get the opportunity to actually go after him. But he does play a pretty impressive game through and through. I will say, though, I think over time, I kind of recognize more so how much he was outplayed by Netta until the very tail end of the game, which that's obviously something to mention, but overall, very solid player. He's here at number 7. At number 6, we just talked about her. We have Netta from BB Can 2 and also 5. But BB Can 2, I think, is a very impressive game. Again, while she is on the bottom initially, she's able to recover from that, along with John forming the sloppy seconds, and they're able to pretty much steamroll the game where she is the best positioned within that alliance. She builds the final 2 with John. She has a final 2 with Heather. She takes out Adele to weaken John in the game. Also has Sabrina wanting to take her to the end as well. So it's she was perfectly positioned by the end game, outside of the fact that John, again, has the killer instinct to cut her. But I think up to that point, I do think she had played the better game, and I do think she would have beaten John at the end, considering their criteria of whoever took the other one to the end, if they were to final two, would win. And I don't think there was any way Netta was going to take John to the end. So again, like, I do think Netta overall played a pretty impressive game in BB2, and BB Can 5 game is not as bad as people say. Obviously, a lot of it's perpetuated by the fact that she was given safety for a lot of the early game, and through that she wanted to play more aggressively to make sure the jury knew that she wasn't relying on this safety. But through that, it caused her threat level to be really massive, though to be fair, her threat level was pretty massive to come in as well. So it's like, I don't really dock her that much for her BB Can 5 game, and her BB Can 2 game is good enough for her to be here at number 6. Now at number 5, we're moving on to BB Can 6, the winner of the season. We do have Paris. And again, for me, Paris is a slightly better version of Netta. Now, I do think Netta's BB2 game is better than Paris's BB Can 6 game, but I do think they are similar style of players. They are these figures that aren't in these big majority alliances, but are able to form a lot of smaller alliances and be major strategic forces within those alliances. Now, obviously, Paris gets a lot of knocks from most people about how poor of a read she had on the game, which again, I do agree. However, I feel like most players do. And I feel like the only reason we know about how bad Paris's reads are is because she was talking to the camera when most other players don't. So again, like, I feel like she was a very strategic player early on. She was one of the more active players throughout a lot of the game. And while she does make a questionable decision in keeping Kayla around at the final 8, it does end up working out for her to where she's able to get into a position where she wins out at the very end. Also in a position where she probably beats anybody if she gets to the end by that point. Where again, like, her versus Derek is kind of close, but like everyone else, she steamrolls in a jury vote. And overall, I do think Paris is a better player than most people give her credit for. She's here at number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to the top player from BB Can 1. Here we do have Emmett. And again, Emmett, extremely dominant game across BB Can 1. Very impressive what he was able to do, where despite being on the block week 1, he is able to form Quattro, to which he becomes a major force in the game, follows it up by completely snowing the shield, to where, again, a lot of the downsides of the shield is how much they believed in Emmett, and he's able to get them to do things that are against their best interests, while he also forms a counter alliance. He obviously has the relationship with Jillian, he forms an alliance with Andrew, he also adds Tala in, and they become the final 4 until Gary comes back into the game. But even at that point, he's able to get Gary to agree to take him to 2. Mind you, again, like, what ends up happening is Dan Giesling comes in and talks some sense into Gary, but if it wasn't for that, more than likely, Emmett would be final 2. Mind you, he would also lose in that final 2 against Gary. But again, at that point, it's because of a twist. Where in a natural scenario, if he gets to the end against Jillian, which is where most scenarios were leading up to, he ends up winning the game. And again, I don't personally have much of a flaw with the fact that he votes out Tala over Gary, as I do feel like for his personal game, that was the more optimal move, as Tala is someone that could win at least part 1 of the HOH in a normal situation. Obviously, it ended up being something super physical, but normally that would be the case, and Tala wasn't taking him to the end. Well, at least with Gary, there was still the shot. So again, like, I feel like overall, Emmett played a very impressive game across BB Can 1. He's here number 4. Now number 3. And again, it used to be where my top 2 were the top 2 of BB Can 7. Sadly, that is not the case anymore. At number 3, we do have Anthony from BB Can 7, who, again, is still an all-time great non-winning player. I mean, he is debatably the best non-winning player across all of Big Brother, but he is for sure across BB Can here. Again, his game is extremely impressive. The fact that he was able to be the best positioned within the Pretty Boys, despite rarely winning a competition, is extremely impressive. Again, he had his final 2 with Dane, he had a final 2 with Mark, he had a final 2 with Kira. Essentially, he was locked for final 2 by the end game. And while I do think it might be a misstep of him to keep Dane around, as obviously Dane beats him in a jury vote, the problem is that he also had Adam in that situation in the game still, who would have also beaten him in a jury vote, and he needs someone to get rid of Adam, especially when Adam wasn't someone taking him to the end. So it's like, obviously there's issues there, and really I think the bigger issue of it all is his inability to win comps, where I do think he needed to study his days more, something he completely neglected in order to gain more credibility over Dane. But even beyond that, I do think also he has a winning scenario even by the time of the final 3 in real life, where if he took Kira to the end, he would have won. Mindly, he never got the opportunity. But if Kira had one final HOH, it's very likely that they bring Anthony to the end and Anthony wins. So it's like Anthony was very close to winning either way, had a lot of control over the entire game, was very impressive in how he was able to manipulate people across the game, and because that he's here at number 3. Now number 2, and the top 2 is big here, obviously. And I think it is a bit of a debate just in general on the philosophy over what is the better Big Brother player, where we have one player that was a very well-rounded player, good at all 3 facets of the game, but was extremely dominant in competitions, while the other player is one that rarely won a competition, but was extremely dominant in the strategic and social aspects of the game. So really the debate here is which one ends up being better. And sadly, at number 2, I do have to go with Kevin Jacobs from BB Can 10, who is obviously the only new person since I made my initial list to crack the top 10. But Kevin's winning game is insane. Like, it is a ridiculous winning game. It is one that we have not seen in years on Big Brother. And for him to do all of it, and for him to maneuver through the game in the way that he did without needing to win a competition is really impressive. The problem is that, again, when this is a list of how you would do on most given seasons, I feel like Kevin is still going to run into trouble on certain other seasons. I feel like there's less consistency with Kevin than there is with the other player. Like, while what Kevin did was very impressive, where despite not being in the initial majority, he was able to maneuver through the game really expertly, I don't know if he's able to do that in most other casts. Mind you, every single time we did see something go wrong for Kevin, we saw him rectify it immediately afterwards, and that is impressive. However, again, like, it's just a much harder road to play. It's like, I feel like the game that Kevin plays is way more impressive than the game of the person we're going to talk about next. But it's essentially a game where, like, he has to play on hard mode, where the number 1 pick is a player that can play on easy mode, and through that will succeed most of the time, while Kevin is someone that might falter more times. And again, when we're talking about a player ranking players based on how I feel like they would play on most given seasons, I do feel like it is that debate that leaves Kevin at number 2 here, despite all the impressive maneuvers that he pulled off on his season. It is insane, like, what he was able to do in flipping the power structure, getting these 2 sides to come after each other, really manipulating Marty expertly, manipulating Josh expertly, getting Josh to take him to final 2 is insane. Like, there's so much impressive within Kevin's game, but I still have to leave him at number 2. And now number 1, the best player for BB Can is still the same person that I had on my original list. At number 1, we do have Dane. And again, for me, Dane is the prototypical Big Brother winner. He is the well-rounded player that is probably lumped into the majority alliance most of the time and is able to win the game from there. But, like, I do feel like Dane is also a step above most of the people you would think in that archetype, in the fact that he is also a very competent strategic thinker and also a very impressive social player. Again, he dominates the competitions on this season, wins 5 HOHs, and I think that's the way it goes on most given seasons. Socially, he was in the center of the entire house. He had the pretty boys. He had his relationships with Damien and Kiki and Esty, to where he was really in the center of everything, especially by the time of the end game. The problem is that he lets those people go before the end, to where he's put into a final 5 position, to where he's really relying on Anthony, but then again, he is able to get Anthony to side with him through some more impressive play there. But again, that did feel like a bit of an unforced error. Again, strategically, it's like he does still make moves on his own. He still gets rid of Corey against Anthony's best interest, and he obviously has a final 2 with Adam that he never planned on sticking to. And really, like, Dane just feels like an overall well-rounded player. He is able to succeed in every facet of the game while also having a massive specialty in the physical aspects of the game. Again, for me, I feel like he is a much more repeatable win than Kevin, where even though Kevin is a much more impressive win in terms of, like, the things that he was able to do, I do feel like Dane is the type of player that can win most times he plays, just due to how consistent he is in competitions and how good he is socially and strategically, to where because that, Dane ends up landing here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every BB Can player. 148 players ranked here. A ridiculously long video here. But again, I wanted to do this ranking. I had fun putting this ranking together. Again, it's the biggest scaled ranking I have ever done. And again, I do plan on doing these other bigger rankings at some point moving forward, ranking every Big Brother US player, ranking every Survivor player, which those will come at some point if I'm still doing YouTube by the time I decide to do them. But I guess the first step towards that is doing BB Can here. And again, this was such a ridiculous process, but obviously coming up, we do have BB Can 11, to where I will be covering it similarly to how I cover most other reality TV seasons at this point, with a cast assessment, mid-season power ranking, season review, and player ranking. So stay tuned for that. And just in general, expect more of the same style of videos from the channel. And thank you to everyone that's been here for the 4 years I've been doing this channel, which is just ridiculous to think about. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.